The great hall of Ashenmore Castle went silent the moment Elena Hartwell stepped through the tall doors. Every eye turned toward her, and every eye held the same cold judgment. She wore the finest dress her mother had left behind, a pale blue gown stitched with silver thread, and she held her chin high even though her hands trembled at her sides. She had traveled 3 days across the northern hills to reach this castle, carrying the last hope of her broken pack with her. She did not know that within minutes, that hope would be crushed in front of hundreds of strangers. Alpha King Damien Ashgrove sat at the head of the long feast table, his dark eyes tracking her approach with the lazy interest of a predator watching something small crawl across open ground. He was the most powerful alpha in the 5 territories, ruler of a kingdom built on strength and fear, and he had agreed to this arranged joining only because his council insisted it would end a decades-old conflict between their 2 packs. He had never wanted a bride. He had certainly never wanted her. Elena stopped a few steps from the table and lowered herself into a graceful bow, the way her mother had taught her before she passed. "My king," she said, "my name is Elena Hartwell, daughter of the Hartwell pack. I have come as promised, to bring peace between our peoples." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire in the great hearth crackled. Somewhere a servant dropped a tray, and the sound rang out like a struck bell in the silence. Damien rose slowly from his seat, walked around the table, and circled her once, studying her the way a buyer studies a horse he has no intention of purchasing. "Peace," he finally said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "You call this peace?" He gestured toward her with an open hand, inviting the court to look closer. "This is what the Hartwell line has become. A pack that once commanded 3 valleys, and now it sends me a girl in a borrowed dress, hoping I will forget that her father broke his oath to my grandfather, and hoping I will forget that her bloodline could not even hold its own territory." Laughter rippled through the hall, some quiet, some open and cruel. Elena felt her face grow hot, but she kept her spine straight. "My father is gone, my king," she said carefully. "I cannot answer for choices I did not make. I only ask that you judge me by my own actions." Damien tilted his head, considering her with something close to amusement. "Brave words," he said, "from someone with nothing left to lose." He turned back toward the table, addressing his court rather than her. "I was told a bride was coming to sit at my side and share my table. Instead, I see a girl dressed like a noble who has no true claim to nobility left." He looked at her over his shoulder, and his next words landed like a slap across the entire room. "She will not sit among us tonight. Take her to the kitchens. Let her eat where she belongs, with the servants who actually earn their place in this castle." A wave of stunned murmurs passed through the hall. Even some of Damien's own advisors exchanged uneasy glances, though none dared speak against him. Elena stood frozen for a heartbeat, disbelief and humiliation crashing over her at once. She had imagined many outcomes for this night, some hopeful, some difficult, but never this. Never a public stripping of her dignity in front of an entire kingdom. A guard stepped forward to take her arm, his grip firm but not unkind, almost apologetic. Elena did not resist. She would not give Damien the satisfaction of watching her fight or beg. Instead, she lifted her chin one final time, met his gaze directly, and said in a voice steady enough that it carried across the hall, "Thank you for your hospitality, my king. I will remember it." Something flickered across Damien's face, gone before anyone could name it, but Elena did not wait to study it further. She turned and walked from the great hall with as much grace as she could hold on to, her borrowed silver thread catching the torchlight one last time before the heavy doors closed behind her. The kitchen was nothing like the hall above. It was hot and loud and smelled of roasting meat and boiling broth, filled with servants rushing between long wooden tables, carrying trays and shouting orders to one another. When Elena entered, escorted by the guard, the room fell into a different kind of silence, one of surprise rather than judgment. A young woman with flour on her apron and kind eyes stepped forward first. "You must be the one they were talking about," she said gently. "I am Mira. Come, sit here, away from the ovens. It is warmer, but it is quieter too." Elena allowed herself to be guided to a bench at the far end of the kitchen. She sat carefully, smoothing her dress out of habit, though it no longer mattered whether it stayed neat. Around her, the servants returned to their work, though many stole glances in her direction, some curious, some pitying, a few even angry on her behalf. Mira set a bowl of stew in front of her, along with a heel of bread. "It is not what they eat upstairs," she said, "but it is warm, and no one here will insult you while you eat it." Elena looked down at the simple meal, and for the first time since entering the castle, she felt something other than humiliation. She felt, strangely, a small measure of relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You did not have to be kind to me." Mira shrugged and sat across from her, lowering her voice. "Kindness costs nothing down here, though it seems to cost a great deal upstairs." She glanced toward the door leading to the hall above, then back to Elena. "I have worked in this castle for 6 years. I have seen many high-born guests come and go. I have never seen the king humiliate someone in front of the whole court like that, not even his enemies." Elena's hand tightened slightly around her spoon. "Then I suppose I should feel honored to be the first," she said, and to her own surprise, there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet steel that had not been there when she walked into the great hall an hour earlier. As the evening wore on, more servants drifted near her table during breaks from their work, offering small kindnesses, a extra piece of bread, a cup of water, a few words of comfort, spoken quietly, so the overseers would not hear. Elena began to understand something the nobles upstairs likely never considered, that the people who kept this castle running, who cooked the meals and carried the water and stoked the fires through the night, saw everything. They saw the king's cruelty just as clearly as she had felt it, and many of them carried old wounds of their own from serving in a court that valued strength above all else and treated weakness, real or perceived, as something to be crushed rather than helped. Near the end of the meal, a tall man with a scarred jaw and quiet eyes entered the kitchen, nodding to a few servants before making his way toward Elena's table. He carried himself differently than the others, with the bearing of someone who had once held real authority, though his simple clothes suggested he no longer did. "You are the Hartwell girl," he said, not unkindly. It was not a question. Elena studied him carefully before answering. "I am," she said. "And you are?" "Callan," he answered simply, taking a seat nearby without waiting for an invitation. "Once a warrior in this king's service. Now I sharpen blades in the armory and keep to myself." He glanced toward the door to the hall above, his jaw tightening slightly. "What happened up there tonight was wrong. Not because you are important, though perhaps you are more important than the king realizes, but because it was cruel for the sake of being cruel. That kind of cruelty rots a kingdom from the inside, slowly, until one day it simply falls apart." Elena considered his words carefully. "Why do you still serve him then, if you believe that?" Callan's expression grew distant for a moment. "Because leaving is not as simple as walking out a gate," he said, "and because some of us are waiting for a reason worth risking everything for." He looked at her directly then, something searching in his gaze, as though measuring her against a thought he had not yet spoken aloud. "Perhaps that reason walked into this kitchen tonight. Perhaps not. Time will tell." Before Elena could respond, a bell rang somewhere above, signaling the end of the feast, and the kitchen erupted into a new flurry of activity, as servants rushed to clear dishes and prepare for the next day. Mira touched Elena's shoulder gently. "Come," she said. "I will show you where you will sleep tonight. It is not what you are used to, but it is safe, and it is yours." Elena rose from the bench, glancing once more toward the door that led back to the great hall, back to the king who had humiliated her without a second thought. She felt the sting of the evening still burning beneath her skin, but beneath that sting, something else was beginning to take root, something quieter, and far more dangerous to the world above than anyone in that castle yet understood. She did not know it that night, sitting among servants who had shown her more kindness in one evening than the king had shown in a single glance. But the humiliation she suffered in that great hall would become the first spark of something the Alpha King Damian Ashgrove would spend the rest of his reign regretting. As she followed Mira down a narrow stone corridor lit by flickering torches, she allowed herself one final thought, before pushing the pain of the evening aside. Somewhere beneath the ash and stone of this castle, a fire had been lit, small and quiet for now, but a fire nonetheless. And fires, given enough time and enough air, had a way of growing into something no king could easily extinguish. The room Mira led her to was small, tucked beneath a stairwell in the servants' quarters, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chest. A single window, no wider than a handspan, let in a thin line of moonlight. It was nothing like the chambers Elena had imagined she would sleep in that night, chambers with tall windows and soft furs, and a fire already burning in the hearth. Yet as she sat on the edge of the thin mattress, she found she did not mind the smallness of the space nearly as much as she expected to. Mira lingered in the doorway, watching her with a careful expression. "It is not much," she said again, as though needing to apologize for something that was not her fault. "It is enough," Elena answered, and she meant it. "Tonight, at least. No one here has looked at me like I am something to be discarded." Mira's expression softened, and she stepped further into the room, lowering her voice even though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Something I probably should not say to a guest of the castle, even one who was sent to the kitchens." Elena nodded, curious, despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "The king was not always like this," Mira said. "Or perhaps he was, but it was different before. He lost someone close to him, years ago, before I came to serve here. The older staff still speak of it sometimes, quietly, when they think no one is listening. Since then he trusts almost no one, and he seems to believe that cruelty keeps him safe from being hurt again. It does not excuse what he did to you tonight. Nothing excuses that. But I thought you should know that the man upstairs did not start out as cold as he is now." Elena considered this for a long moment, turning the words over in her mind. It was strange, hearing something almost like sympathy offered on behalf of the man who had humiliated her so completely just hours earlier. She did not feel forgiveness toward him, not even a small measure of it, but she filed the information away carefully, the way she had learned to file away every piece of knowledge that might prove useful later. Understanding an enemy, her mother used to say, was often more valuable than hating one. "Thank you for telling me," Elena said finally. "I do not know what I will do with that knowledge yet, but I am glad to have it." Mira smiled faintly and moved toward the door. "Rest, if you can," she said. "Tomorrow will come early, and the kitchens do not wait for anyone, highborn or not. If you need anything through the night, my room is just down the corridor, third door on the left." After Mira left, Elena remained sitting on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the thin line of moonlight stretching across the stone floor. She thought of her father, gone now for nearly 2 years, and the promises he had made before his death about rebuilding what their pack had lost. She thought of her mother, who had died even before that, leaving behind only a handful of dresses and a great deal of quiet wisdom that Elena was only now beginning to understand the value of. And she thought of the great hall above her, filled with nobles who had laughed at her humiliation, as though it were entertainment crafted purely for their amusement. She did not cry. She had expected that she might, once she was finally alone, but instead she found a strange calm settling over her, one that felt almost unfamiliar after the chaos of the evening. It was not peace exactly. It was something closer to resolve, quiet and steady, forming somewhere deep beneath the hurt. She rose from the bed and moved to the small window, pressing her palm against the cold stone beside it. Somewhere beyond the castle walls lay the ruins of her family's old territory, 3 valleys that had once belonged to the Hartwell pack before betrayal and misfortune stripped them away piece by piece. She had come to this castle hoping to rebuild something through peace, through a joining that would tie 2 broken histories back together. That hope had been crushed within minutes of walking through the doors. But hope, she reminded herself, was not the only path forward. There were other ways to rebuild what had been lost, other ways to reclaim a name that had been dragged through the mud in front of an entire court. She did not yet know what that path looked like, not completely, but she understood with sudden clarity that the version of herself who had walked into that great hall hours earlier, hopeful and eager to please a king who had no intention of accepting her, was already gone. Something else had taken her place, something quieter, but far less willing to bow. A soft knock came at her door sometime later, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Callan standing in the corridor, a small bundle wrapped in cloth held in his hands. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering it to her. "It is only a warm blanket and a bit of bread for the morning. The mornings here start before the sun rises, and no one thinks to feed the new arrivals until midday, if they remember at all." Elena accepted the bundle, surprised again by the quiet kindness she kept encountering, in a place that had shown her nothing but cruelty from those above. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You do not know me. Neither does Mira." Callan considered the question seriously before answering. Because I have spent years watching this castle reward cruelty and punish decency, he said. And because tonight, for the first time in a long while, I saw someone stand in front of the king and refuse to break. That matters more than you might realize. He paused, glancing down the corridor, as though making sure they were truly alone. There are others here, beyond myself and Mira, who feel the same weight pressing down on this kingdom. We do not speak of it openly. It is not safe to. But know that you are not entirely without allies within these walls, even if the great hall above believes otherwise. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the very real danger of trusting the wrong person inside a king's own castle. Something in his steady gaze convinced her, at least for tonight, that he was telling the truth. I will remember that, she said quietly. Thank you, Callan. He nodded once, then turned and disappeared back down the corridor, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts once more. She closed the door and sat back down on the edge of the bed, unwrapping the bread and holding the blanket close against the chill seeping through the stone walls. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges. She had no illusions that the king's cruelty had ended with a single humiliating meal. If anything, tonight had likely been only the beginning of whatever trial he intended to put her through, whether out of genuine contempt for her bloodline, or simply because he enjoyed watching others suffer beneath his authority. But as she finally lay down and closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, Elena held onto the small, steady flame of resolve that had been lit within her that night. She did not know yet how long the road ahead would be, or how much she would have to endure before she could reclaim what had been stolen from her family. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she would not leave this kingdom the same powerless girl who had walked through its gates that morning. Whatever came next, she intended to meet it standing tall, no matter how many times the world above tried to force her to her knees. The pot of boiling water tipped dangerously close to the edge of the stove, and Elena caught it just in time, her hands already red and raw from a week of scrubbing floors and carrying water buckets up and down the castle stairs. She had never worked this hard in her life, not even during the difficult years after her father lost most of the Hartwell territory, and yet each morning she rose before dawn without complaint, determined not to give anyone in this castle a reason to say she could not endure what had been placed in front of her. Steady there, Mira called from across the kitchen, hurrying over to help her set the pot down safely. You will scald yourself if you are not careful. 6 days in, and you already move like you have worked a kitchen your whole life. But that pot has a temper of its own. Elena managed a tired smile, wiping a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. I am learning quickly, she said, mostly because I have no other choice. It had been 6 days since the Great Hall, 6 days since the king's cruel words had echoed through the court and sent her to live among the servants. In that time, Elena had learned more about Ashenmore Castle than she suspected most of the nobles upstairs would ever bother to notice. She had learned which guards treated the kitchen staff with basic decency, and which ones enjoyed throwing their weight around simply because they could. She had learned that the head cook, a stern woman named Old Greta, ran her kitchen with an iron will, but also quietly saved the best cuts of meat for the servants who worked hardest, a small act of fairness in a castle that seemed to have very little of it. And she had learned, most importantly, that the cruelty she witnessed the night of the feast was not an isolated moment, but a pattern woven through every level of how this kingdom operated. That morning, as Elena carried a tray of bread toward the servants' dining table, she overheard 2 guards speaking near the kitchen entrance, their voices low, but not quiet enough to escape her hearing. Another tax collection in the eastern villages, one guard muttered. 3rd one this season. The farmers there have nothing left to give, and the king's stewards do not seem to care. The other guard shrugged. The king needs coin for the new border defenses. What the eastern villages want does not concern him much these days. Elena slowed her steps just enough to catch the rest of their conversation, before continuing on her way, filing the information carefully alongside everything else she had gathered over the past week. It was becoming clear to her that Damien's cruelty was not confined to a single humiliating dinner. It ran through the bones of his entire kingdom, from the highest halls to the smallest farming villages at its edges. The people who suffered under his rule were rarely the nobles who sat at his table. They were the servants who worked his kitchens, the farmers who tilled his fields, and the soldiers who fought his battles without ever receiving the recognition or reward their loyalty deserved. Later that afternoon, while Elena helped carry supplies to the castle armory, she found Callan sharpening a row of blades along a long wooden bench, his movements precise and practiced, despite the heaviness that seemed to settle over him whenever he spoke of the kingdom's current state. "You look thoughtful," he observed without looking up from his work. "I have been listening more than talking this week," Elena admitted, setting down the crate of supplies she carried. "I am starting to understand this kingdom is not simply a court with one cruel king. It is something larger, and something far more broken than I first realized." Callan set down the blade he had been working on, and finally met her eyes. "You are not wrong," he said. "Damien was not always so careless with his people. When his father ruled, there was hardship, certainly, but also a sense that the crown answered to something beyond its own comfort. Since Damien took the throne, and especially since he lost someone close to him a few years back, that sense of accountability has faded. His advisors, particularly a man named Lord Garrick, have taken advantage of his withdrawal from real leadership. Garrick handles most of the kingdom's affairs now, while the king busies himself with matters of war and border defense, leaving the everyday suffering of common people to go largely unnoticed." Elena absorbed this information carefully. "And no one challenges this Lord Garrick?" she asked. "Challenging Garrick means challenging the king by extension," Callan said grimly. "Few are foolish enough to risk that, myself included, at least until now." He studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing behind his eyes. "You have been asking a great many careful questions this week, Elena. I do not think you are simply trying to survive your circumstances here. I think you are trying to understand something larger." Elena hesitated, weighing how much to reveal even to someone she had come to trust in a short amount of time. "I do not yet know what I intend to do with what I am learning," she admitted honestly. "But I refuse to simply exist in this castle as a symbol of humiliation, waiting for the king to decide my fate. If there is a way to help the people suffering under this rule, even in some small measure, I want to understand how before I decide what comes next." Callan nodded slowly, a flicker of something like respect crossing his scarred features. "That is a dangerous ambition to carry inside these walls," he said, "but it is not one I intend to discourage." That evening, as the kitchen staff gathered for their own quiet meal, after the upstairs feast had been served and cleared away, Elena found herself seated beside Mira and an older servant named Old Greta, who rarely spoke much beyond giving orders, but seemed to have taken a quiet liking to Elena's work ethic over the past week. "You handle hardship well for someone raised in a noble house," Old Greta remarked, studying Elena over her bowl of stew. "Most highborn folk who end up down here would have wept themselves sick by now, or demanded someone fix their situation for them." "I was raised to believe complaining rarely solves anything," Elena replied. "My mother used to say that the world does not owe kindness to anyone, highborn or otherwise, so it is wiser to build strength than to wait for fairness that may never come." Old Greta's expression softened slightly, an unusual occurrence for a woman known throughout the kitchen for her stern discipline. "Your mother sounds like she understood something most nobles never learn," she said. She paused, then added more quietly, "You should know, girl, that the servants here talk among themselves more than the folk upstairs realize. Word of what happened to you at that feast spread through every corner of this castle within a single night. Many of us have wondered what kind of person you truly are, beneath the dress and the noble title. This past week has answered that question rather clearly." Elena felt an unexpected warmth at the older woman's words, a small measure of belonging forming in a place that had begun as nothing more than a punishment. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I did not expect to find any comfort here when I first arrived. I am grateful to have been wrong." As the days continued to pass, Elena's understanding of the castle and its inner workings deepened further. She began noticing small details others might overlook, the way certain guards avoided Lord Garrick's gaze out of clear discomfort, the way the kitchen received fewer supplies each month despite the king's treasury reportedly growing larger, the way servants who asked too many questions about castle finances sometimes disappeared from their posts without explanation, reassigned to distant outposts, or simply dismissed without cause. Each piece of information settled into place within her mind, like stones building toward some larger structure she could not yet fully see. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elena was sent to deliver a message to the castle library on behalf of Old Greta, who needed information about an upcoming feast recorded in the household ledgers. The library was a place Elena had not yet visited, tucked into a quiet wing of the castle, rarely used by anyone beyond a handful of scholars and advisors. As she searched among the shelves for the ledger old Greta requested, her attention was drawn to an older section of the library, filled with dusty volumes that appeared untouched for years. Curiosity pulled her closer, and she found herself examining a row of books detailing the histories of various packs and bloodlines throughout the 5 territories. Nearly all of the great families were represented, their histories, their strengths, their eventual rises or falls recorded in careful detail. She searched for any mention of the Hartwell name and found only a brief, dismissive paragraph describing her family's fall from power, written in a tone that suggested the author had considered the matter unworthy of further attention. But as she moved further down the shelf, her fingers brushed against a much older volume, its leather binding cracked and faded with age, tucked behind newer books, as though someone had once tried to hide it from casual notice. She pulled it free carefully and opened it to find pages describing an ancient bloodline, referred to only as the Emberkin, a pack said to have vanished generations ago under mysterious circumstances, their territory absorbed into the surrounding kingdoms, and their history largely erased from common record. The book described the Emberkin as possessing abilities beyond typical pack strength, tied to some ancient connection with fire and transformation that had made them both revered and feared throughout the territories before their sudden and unexplained disappearance. Elena stared at the faded illustration accompanying the text, an image of markings said to appear on true descendants of the Emberkin line, spiraling patterns similar to flame reaching toward the sky. Something about the image stirred a strange, distant familiarity within her, though she could not immediately place why. She had never heard her mother or father speak of any connection to such an ancient and mysterious bloodline, yet something about standing in this quiet library, holding this forgotten book, made her pulse quicken in a way she did not fully understand. Before she could examine the book further, footsteps echoed down the library corridor, and Elena quickly tucked the volume beneath her arm, slipping it into the folds of her apron, before any of the castle's scholars could notice her interest in something that clearly was not meant to be found by servants wandering the shelves. She retrieved the ledger old Greta had requested and made her way back toward the kitchen, her mind racing with questions she could not yet answer. That night, alone in her small room beneath the stairwell, Elena opened the ancient book by candlelight, reading every page with careful attention, searching for any connection between the vanished Emberkin bloodline and her own family history. She found no definitive answer within its pages, only fragments and hints, old stories, that raised more questions than they resolved. Yet as she finally closed the book and blew out her candle, she could not shake the growing suspicion that the humiliation she had suffered in the Great Hall, the very event that had sent her tumbling into the depths of this castle's kitchens and corridors, might have led her towards something far larger than she ever could have anticipated when she first arrived at Ashenmore Castle 2 weeks earlier. Whatever secrets the old book held about the Emberkin bloodline, she intended to uncover them, no matter how long it took, or how carefully she needed to search. The following morning, Elena returned to her duties in the kitchen, with the hidden book tucked safely beneath the loose floorboard she had discovered on her second night in the small room beneath the stairwell. She moved through her chores with practiced calm, careful not to let her thoughts drift too openly to the questions racing through her mind, though Mira noticed her distraction almost immediately. "You are somewhere else today," Mira said, nudging her gently as they carried baskets of vegetables toward the washing basin. "What has you so quiet?" Elena considered how much to share, then decided a partial truth was safer than an outright lie to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. "I found something in the library yesterday," she admitted quietly, "an old book, about a bloodline that vanished generations ago. I do not fully understand why, but something about it feels connected to me somehow." Mira's eyebrows lifted with interest, though she kept her voice low. "The library keeper does not usually allow servants to browse those older shelves," she said. "If you found something hidden back there, it was likely hidden for a reason. You should be careful who you mention this to, Elena. Not everyone in this castle can be trusted with secrets, even small ones." Elena nodded, grateful for the warning, though it only deepened her sense that she had stumbled onto something significant. As the two women worked through the morning, scrubbing vegetables and preparing trays for the midday meal, Elena's mind kept returning to the spiraling flame markings described in the old book, wondering if such a thing could truly exist within her own bloodline, hidden and forgotten the way so much of her family's history had been lost after her father's downfall. Her thoughts were interrupted when a sharp voice called from the kitchen entrance, cutting through the usual clatter of pots and conversation. Lord Garrick stood in the doorway, his expensive robes looking distinctly out of place among the steam and heat of the kitchen. He was a tall man, with sharp features and calculating eyes, the kind of gaze that seemed to measure everyone he looked at for potential usefulness or threat. "The servant girl, Hartwell," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "The king wishes a word with you. Come." The kitchen fell into an uneasy hush. Elena set down the vegetables she had been washing, wiping her hands carefully on her apron before stepping forward, aware of the many eyes following her movement across the room. She caught Callan's gaze near the doorway, where he had been delivering a delivery of sharpened tools, and saw a flicker of concern cross his scarred features, before he masked it with careful neutrality. She followed Lord Garrick through the winding corridors of the castle, moving from the humble stone passages of the servants' quarters into the grander, more ornate hallways reserved for nobility and court business. Garrick said nothing during the walk, though she caught him studying her sideways more than once, his expression unreadable. They arrived at a private study rather than the great hall, a smaller room lined with maps and old weapons mounted along the walls. Damien stood near a wide window overlooking the castle grounds, his back turned toward the door as they entered. Garrick gave a short bow and departed without a word, leaving Elena alone with the king for the first time since the humiliating feast 2 weeks earlier. For a long moment, neither spoke. Elena refused to break the silence first, standing with her hands folded in front of her, waiting with as much patience as she could summon despite the nervous energy coiling tightly in her chest. "You have adapted quickly to your new circumstances," Damien finally said, still facing the window. "I expected tears within the first few days. Perhaps a formal request to be sent home in disgrace. Instead, my staff tell me you work harder than servants who have been here for years." "I was not given the option of disgrace being useful to me," Elena replied evenly. "So I chose to be useful in whatever way remained available." Damien finally turned to face her, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made it difficult to guess his thoughts. "That is a practical answer," he said. "Practical, and perhaps a bit defiant, wrapped in careful politeness." "I did not realize defiance was forbidden for someone eating with the servants," Elena said before she could stop herself, immediately wondering if she had pushed too far. A long pause followed, and for a moment, she feared she had made a serious mistake. Then, unexpectedly, something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed Damien's features, before vanishing just as quickly, replaced by his usual guarded coldness. "You are dismissed," he said simply, turning back toward the window without further explanation for why he had summoned her at all. Elena left the study with more questions than answers, uncertain what the strange, brief meeting had truly accomplished, beyond confirming that the king was, at the very least, aware of her continued presence within his castle. As she made her way back toward the kitchen, her thoughts returned once more to the hidden book beneath her floorboard, and the growing certainty that whatever waited for her within those old, faded pages might prove far more important to her future than anything that had just occurred in that quiet study with the Alpha King, who had once humiliated her in front of his entire court. Smoke curled from the edge of the wooden spoon, before Elena even realized what had happened. She dropped it immediately, startled, watching as a thin trail of smoke rose from the scorched handle, where her fingers had gripped it only seconds earlier. Around her, the kitchen continued its usual chaos, no one noticing the strange scorch mark left behind on the wood, but Elena stared at her own hand, as though it belonged to a stranger. "That is the third time this week," she whispered to herself, glancing around quickly to make sure no one had seen. Since discovering the old book about the vanished Emberkin bloodline nearly 10 days earlier, small, unexplainable occurrences had begun happening around her with increasing frequency. A candle she stood too close to had flared unexpectedly bright one evening. A pot of water she touched while distracted had begun steaming faster than the fire beneath it should have allowed. Each incident was small enough to dismiss individually, yet together they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore any longer. That night, once her chores were finished and the kitchen had quieted for the evening, Elena retrieved the old book from beneath her floorboard and read through its pages once more by candlelight, searching for any detail that might explain what was happening to her. The book spoke of the Emberkin bloodline possessing a connection to fire that grew stronger as descendants aged into their full strength, often triggered by moments of intense emotion. danger, or necessity. It described physical markings that would eventually appear on true descendants, spiraling patterns resembling flame, usually along the forearm or shoulder, though the exact timing and manner of their appearance varied from person to person. Elena rolled up her sleeve carefully and examined her forearm in the candlelight, finding nothing unusual against her pale skin. Disappointed, but not entirely surprised, she closed the book and sat in thoughtful silence, turning the mystery over in her mind. If she truly carried some remnant of this ancient bloodline, she needed answers, and she needed them from someone who might actually understand what was happening to her, someone far more knowledgeable than she could ever hope to become through candlelit reading alone. The following afternoon, while delivering supplies to the far edge of the castle grounds near the old stables, Elena noticed an elderly woman sitting alone beneath a large oak tree, weaving a basket from dried reeds with practiced, careful hands. She had seen the woman occasionally around the castle grounds before, always alone, always quiet, rarely acknowledged by anyone else who passed her by. Something about the woman's calm, watchful presence drew Elena's attention that day in a way it had not before. Elena approached slowly, unsure why she felt compelled to speak with a stranger, who seemed content in her solitude. The woman looked up before Elena could say anything, her pale eyes sharp and knowing despite the deep wrinkles lining her weathered face. "You carry something heavy today, child," the woman said, her voice carrying an unusual accent Elena could not immediately place. "Heavier than firewood and water buckets, I think." Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a complete stranger, yet something about the woman's steady gaze felt oddly reassuring. "I am not certain what I carry," she admitted honestly. "Strange things have been happening around me lately. Small fires, unexplained heat. I found an old book in the library, about a bloodline called the Emberkin. I do not know if any of it means anything, or if I am simply imagining connections that do not exist." The woman's weaving paused entirely, her sharp eyes fixing on Elena with sudden, intense focus. "Say that name again," she said quietly. "Emberkin," Elena repeated, her pulse quickening at the woman's reaction. The old woman set aside her basket and rose slowly from her seated position, studying Elena from head to toe, with an expression that had shifted from casual curiosity to something far more serious. "Show me your forearm," she said. Elena hesitated only a moment before rolling up her sleeve once more, revealing the same unmarked skin she had examined the night before. The old woman took her arm gently, but firmly, running weathered fingers along the skin, murmuring something under her breath, in a language Elena did not recognize. After a long moment, faint warmth spread across Elena's forearm, and to her astonishment, a pale spiraling mark began to slowly appear beneath the skin, glowing softly, before fading back to nearly invisible, leaving behind only a faint discoloration where nothing had existed moments before. Elena stared at her own arm in stunned silence, unable to find words for what she had just witnessed. "My name is Elowen," the old woman said quietly, releasing Elena's arm. "I have waited a very long time for a descendant of the Emberkin line to walk through these castle grounds. I had begun to fear the bloodline had truly ended, as most believe it did generations ago." "You know about my bloodline?" Elena managed to ask, still staring at the faint mark on her arm. "How?" "Because I am the last living Emberkin elder," Elowen answered simply. "Or I was, until this very moment. Now, it seems, there are two of us." Elena's mind reeled with the implications of what she was hearing. She sank down onto the grass beside the old oak tree, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "Please," she said, "tell me everything. I do not understand what any of this means, or why my family never spoke of it." Elowen settled back down beside her, her expression growing distant as old memories surfaced. "The Emberkin were once a proud and powerful bloodline," she began, "feared and respected throughout the 5 territories for our connection to fire and transformation, abilities passed down through careful bloodlines and generations of discipline. But power like ours has always attracted danger. Many kingdoms feared what we might become if left unchecked, and eventually, a coalition of rival packs moved against us, generations ago, scattering our people and forcing survivors into hiding. Most Emberkin descendants chose to bury their heritage completely, marrying into other bloodlines and letting the old power fade quietly, rather than risk drawing the same danger toward their children. That must be what happened within my family. Elena said slowly, pieces beginning to fall into place. My father never spoke of ancestors beyond a few generations back. I assumed it was simply because our family history was unremarkable. It was likely intentional, Elowen said, deliberately buried to keep you and your ancestors safe from those who might still fear or covet Emberkin's strength. Elena sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing everything she had just learned. Finally, she looked up at the old woman, with a question that had been building since the moment the spiraling mark first appeared on her arm. Can you teach me? She asked. Can you help me understand what I am capable of, and how to control it? Elowen studied her carefully before answering, as though weighing the wisdom of such a decision. It will not be easy, she said finally. The training required to properly awaken and control Emberkin's strength is demanding, both physically and mentally. It also carries real risk, Elena. If word spreads that a true Emberkin descendant walks these grounds, particularly within a kingdom ruled by an alpha as powerful and unpredictable as Damien Ashgrove, you may find yourself in far greater danger than simple humiliation at a dinner table. I have already survived humiliation, Elena said firmly. I would rather face real danger with real strength than continue living quietly as someone this kingdom believes to be powerless. Something like approval flickered across Elowen's weathered features. Very well, she said. We will begin your training, but it must remain absolutely secret. No one within this castle can know what you are learning, not even those you trust. The fewer who know, the safer you remain, at least until you are strong enough to protect that secret yourself. Over the following days, Elena began meeting Elowen in secret, using stolen moments during breaks from her kitchen duties, or late at night after her chores were finished, slipping quietly toward the old oak tree at the edge of the castle grounds, or, when weather made outdoor meetings unwise, into a hidden alcove within the older, less frequented sections of the castle that Elowen seemed to know intimately, despite rarely being seen wandering the halls herself. The training was unlike anything Elena had expected. Elowen taught her first to recognize the warmth building within her own body, a subtle heat that had always existed, but that Elena had never learned to identify or control. Slowly, through patient repetition and careful guidance, Elena learned to summon small flickers of flame at her fingertips, controlled and deliberate, rather than the unpredictable outbursts that had scorched wooden spoons and startled candle flames in recent weeks. It is not simply about summoning fire, Elowen explained during one late-night session, watching as Elena practiced holding a small, steady flame above her open palm. True Emberkin strength lies in discipline and control. Fire given without restraint destroys everything around it, including the one who summons it. Fire given with purpose and control can protect, can illuminate, can transform. The difference between the two is entirely a matter of the will guiding it. Elena absorbed every lesson with fierce determination, driven by a hunger to understand this newly discovered part of herself and, perhaps more importantly, driven by the quiet resolve that had taken root within her since that first humiliating night in the Great Hall. Each evening she practiced, she felt herself growing not only more capable, but more certain of the path forming ahead of her, though she still could not yet see exactly where that path might lead. Nearly 3 weeks into her secret training, as Elena successfully summoned and controlled the largest flame she had managed thus far, holding it steady above her palm, without flinching or losing focus, Elowen watched with an expression of quiet pride, mixed with something more serious and calculating. You learn faster than I anticipated, the old woman said. Faster, perhaps, than is entirely safe. She paused, studying Elena carefully. There is something you should understand, Elena. The strength you carry is not meant only for small displays of control in hidden corners of a castle that scorns you. The old Emberkin bloodline once commanded respect and loyalty from entire territories. If you continue on this path, truly mastering what lies within you, you may find yourself capable of far more than simply surviving within these castle walls. You may find yourself capable of reclaiming everything your family lost, and more besides. Elena lowered her hand, the flame extinguishing gently as she considered the old woman's words. I do not yet know if I am ready for something so large, she admitted honestly. Few ever feel entirely ready, Elowen said gently. Readiness often arrives only after necessity forces us to become what we must. For now, continue training, continue growing. When the time comes that you must step fully into what you are capable of becoming, you will know it, and you will be far more prepared than you feel in this moment. As Elena made her way back toward the servants' quarters that night, the weight of everything she had learned settling heavily, but not unwelcome, across her shoulders, she found herself thinking once more of the great hall, of Damien's cold dismissal, of the humiliation that had first sent her tumbling into the depths of this castle. What had once felt like the lowest point of her life, now felt, strangely, like the beginning of something far larger than she ever could have imagined, walking through those castle gates weeks earlier. She did not yet know how long her training would take, or what dangers waited ahead should her secret ever be discovered. But for the first time since arriving at Ashenmore Castle, Elena Hartwell felt something stirring within her that went far beyond simple survival. She felt, quietly and cautiously, the first true stirrings of purpose. A few nights later, Elena returned to her small room, to find Mira waiting outside her door, arms crossed, an expression of concern rather than accusation written across her face. "You have been disappearing at strange hours," Mira said quietly, once Elena approached. "I am not the only one who has noticed. Old Greta mentioned it yesterday, though she did not seem overly concerned. I only worry because I care what happens to you here, Elena, and secrets in this castle have a way of turning dangerous quickly." Elena hesitated, torn between Elowen's warning to keep her training absolutely secret and her growing trust in Mira, who had shown her nothing but kindness and honesty since the very first night. After a long moment of consideration, she made a decision. "Walk with me," she said quietly, leading Mira toward a quiet corner near the kitchen storeroom where they could speak without being overheard. "I trust you," Elena began carefully, "more than almost anyone I have met in this castle. What I am about to tell you must remain between us. Even Callan does not know the full truth yet." Mira nodded solemnly, and Elena spent the next several minutes explaining what she had discovered, the old book in the library, the strange occurrences that had begun happening around her, her meetings with Elowen beneath the old oak tree. She did not demonstrate her growing abilities, not yet, but she trusted Mira enough to share the truth of what was happening. Mira listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through surprise, then wonder, then something like quiet excitement. When Elena finished, Mira was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I always suspected there was something different about you," she admitted. "Not simply your bloodline or your title, but something deeper. I am glad you trusted me with this, Elena. I promise your secret is safe." "Thank you," Elena said, relief washing through her. "It helps to know at least one person here understands what I am truly facing, beyond simple kitchen work and castle gossip." Mira reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever this becomes," she said, "whatever you are meant to do with this strength you are discovering, know that you do not have to face it entirely alone. Not while I am here, and not while Callan remains loyal to whatever you decide to become." The following week, Elena's training with Elowen continued to intensify, moving beyond simple control of small flames, toward more complex exercises, involving sustained focus under pressure and discipline, drawing on emotional control just as much as physical technique. Elowen explained that true Emberkin strength required more than simply summoning fire, that it required understanding oneself deeply enough to remain steady even when circumstances around a person grew chaotic or threatening. During one particularly difficult session, as Elena struggled to maintain control over a flame, while Elowen deliberately startled her with sudden noises and unexpected movements, testing her ability to hold discipline under stress, Elena finally lost her temper, extinguishing the flame abruptly and turning toward her mentor with visible frustration. "Why must every lesson involve pushing me toward failure?" she demanded, more sharply than she intended. "Because the world beyond this hidden corner of the castle will not wait patiently for you to master your strength and comfort," Elowen answered calmly, entirely unbothered by Elena's frustration. "If you cannot maintain control when startled or threatened here, in a place of relative safety, you will certainly lose control when facing true danger. Better to fail here, in front of me, than to fail when the consequences are far greater." Elena took a slow breath, forcing her frustration to settle, recognizing the wisdom beneath Elowen's demanding methods, even as she resented the difficulty of the lessons themselves. "You are right," she admitted quietly. "I apologize for my temper." "There is no need to apologize for having a temper," Elowen said, her tone softening slightly. "Only for allowing it to control you, rather than the other way around. Try again." Elena nodded, closing her eyes briefly to steady herself before summoning the flame once more. this time holding it steady, even as Elowen clapped her hands sharply beside her ear without warning. The flame flickered, but did not extinguish, and Elena opened her eyes to find her mentor studying her with quiet approval. "Better," Elowen said simply. "Much better." As the weeks continued to pass, Elena's secret training became a steady anchor amid the ongoing demands of her kitchen duties and the ever-present tension of living within a castle ruled by a king who had shown her nothing but cold dismissal since their brief meeting in his private study. She grew stronger, both in her control over the Emberkin strength awakening within her and in her quiet resolve regarding what she eventually intended to do with that strength. She did not yet share her full plans with anyone, not even Elowen or Mira, though she suspected both of them understood that she was building toward something larger than simply enduring her circumstances within Ashenmoor Castle indefinitely. What Elena did not yet know, as she continued her secret lessons beneath the old oak tree, and within the hidden alcoves of the castle's quieter corridors, was that her careful secrecy would soon be tested in ways far more dangerous than simple curious glances from fellow servants. Somewhere within the castle's grander halls, attention was beginning to turn toward her once again, attention that would soon threaten to unravel everything she had worked so carefully to build in the quiet weeks since her humiliating arrival. The accusation came without warning, delivered by 2 castle guards who marched into the kitchen just as the midday meal preparation reached its busiest hour. Elena, elbow deep in a basin of washing water, looked up along with every other servant in the room as the guards approached her directly, their expressions grim and their hands resting purposefully near the hilts of their swords. "Elena Hartwell," one guard announced, his voice cutting through the clatter of pots and pans. "You are to come with us immediately, by order of Lord Garrick. A valuable silver ornament has gone missing from the upper chambers, and witnesses claim to have seen you near that section of the castle 2 nights ago." Elena set down the dish she had been washing, her heart beginning to pound despite her outward calm. "I have not been near the upper chambers in weeks," she said carefully. "I do not know what silver ornament you are referring to, and I certainly did not take anything." The guards exchanged a glance that suggested they had expected denial and were unmoved by it. "That is not for us to decide," the second guard said. "Lord Garrick wishes to question you personally. Come along, quietly, and this will go easier for everyone." Elena's mind raced as the guards led her from the kitchen, aware of the shocked and worried glances following her departure from Mira and several other servants who had grown fond of her over the past weeks. She knew immediately, with a sinking certainty, that the accusation was false. She had spent every free moment of the past 2 nights, not near the upper chambers at all, but with Elowen, deep in training, beneath the old oak tree, at the edge of the castle grounds. Someone, it seemed, had decided to manufacture a reason to bring her before Lord Garrick, and Elena suspected the timing was far from coincidental. She was led not to a formal chamber for questioning, but to a small, windowless room, deep within the castle's administrative wing, sparsely furnished, with only a single table and 2 chairs. Lord Garrick waited there already, standing near the table with his arms folded, his expression carrying the same calculating coldness Elena remembered from their brief encounter weeks earlier. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. Elena obeyed, keeping her expression carefully neutral despite the anxiety tightening in her chest. "I did not take any silver ornament, my lord," she said before he could begin his questioning. "I have not been near the upper chambers in weeks. Whoever claims to have witnessed me there is mistaken, or lying." Garrick studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching her face for any sign of weakness or deception. "Perhaps," he said finally, "or perhaps you have simply grown skilled at deception during your time here, Miss Hartwell. I have noticed you keep unusual company lately. Late-night wanderings. Meetings with the old woman who lives at the edge of the grounds, a woman few in this castle trust or understand. I wonder what business a kitchen servant might have with someone like that, unless she is learning skills useful for slipping unnoticed through castle corridors better left unexplored." Elena's stomach tightened with sudden alarm, realizing that her secret meetings with Elowen had not gone as unnoticed as she believed. She kept her expression steady, refusing to give Garrick the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "I speak with many people in this castle, my lord," she said carefully. "I fail to see how that relates to a missing silver ornament I had no involvement with." Garrick leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something quieter and more threatening. I do not know what you are truly involved in, Miss Hartwell, he said, but I intend to find out. This missing silver is a small matter, easily resolved or dismissed, depending on how cooperative you prove to be. But know this, if I discover you are engaged in anything more concerning than simple theft, the consequences will extend far beyond a stern warning. He straightened and moved toward the door, pausing before leaving entirely. You are dismissed for now, he said, but do not think this matter, or my attention toward you, has ended. Elena remained seated for a long moment after Garrick departed, her hands trembling slightly, with a mixture of anger and fear that she had not allowed herself to fully feel during the confrontation itself. The accusation of theft had clearly been nothing more than a pretense, an excuse to bring her before Garrick and test how much he suspected about her true activities. The realization that he had noticed her meetings with Elowin sent a fresh wave of alarm through her, knowing how carefully she had believed she was concealing her secret training. When she finally returned to the kitchen, Mira rushed toward her immediately, relief evident on her face. What happened? She asked urgently. Are you all right? I am fine, Elena said, though her voice carried more tension than she intended. Garrick knows I have been meeting with Elowin. The silver accusation was simply an excuse to threaten me, to see how I would react. Mira's expression darkened with worry. This is dangerous, Elena, she said quietly. If Garrick suspects something and reports his suspicions to the king, or worse, decides to investigate further on his own, everything you have built here could be at serious risk. That evening, Elena hurried to find Elowin at their usual meeting place beneath the old oak tree, relaying everything that had transpired with Lord Garrick. Elowin listened with grave attention, her expression growing increasingly serious as Elena finished her account. This is precisely the danger I warned you about when we began your training, Elowin said finally. Garrick is not a man who forgets suspicion easily, nor one who hesitates to act on it once his curiosity is sufficiently aroused. If he continues investigating and discovers even a fraction of the truth about what you truly are, the consequences could be severe, not only for you, but for myself and anyone else connected to your training. What should I do? Elena asked, fear and frustration mixing within her voice. I cannot simply stop training, not now, not after everything I have already discovered about myself. Elowin was quiet for a long moment, considering the situation carefully before responding. Perhaps the time has come to consider leaving this castle entirely, she said finally. Your training has progressed further than I initially anticipated. You possess enough control now to survive beyond these walls, though certainly not enough to consider yourself fully mastered in your abilities. Remaining here, under increasing suspicion from a man like Garrick, grows more dangerous with each passing day. Leave the castle, Elena repeated slowly, the weight of the suggestion settling heavily across her shoulders. And go where? I have no territory left to return to. My family's lands were absorbed by neighboring pacts years ago. There are places beyond this kingdom's borders where Emberkin history still lingers, faintly, in old ruins and scattered communities who remember, even if only in legend, the strength our bloodline once carried, Elowin said. If you are willing to undertake such a journey, I believe there is a path forward for you, beyond simply surviving within these castle walls, hiding your true nature from a court that has already shown you nothing but cruelty and suspicion. Elena considered this carefully, weighing the fear of the unknown against the growing danger of remaining within Ashenmore Castle under Garrick's watchful, suspicious eyes. Before she could fully decide, however, circumstances forced her hand far more quickly than she anticipated. 3 days after her confrontation with Lord Garrick, Elena was summoned once again, this time not to a private questioning room, but directly to the Great Hall, the very place where her humiliation had begun weeks earlier. She arrived to find Damien seated at the head of the long table, Lord Garrick standing beside him, and a small crowd of nobles gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. Elena Hartwell, Damien said, his tone carrying none of the earlier ambiguity from their private meeting weeks before. Lord Garrick has brought serious concerns to my attention. He believes you have been engaged in activities within this castle that extend far beyond simple kitchen duties, secret meetings, unexplained absences. He suspects, and I am inclined to share his suspicion, that you may be involved in something that threatens the security of this kingdom. Elena's heart pounded as she stood before the assembled court once more, painfully aware of how quickly circumstances had turned against her. I have done nothing to threaten this kingdom, my king, she said firmly, refusing to let fear creep into her voice, despite the danger of the moment. I have only tried to survive within circumstances I did not choose. Damien studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps you have used the humiliation I subjected you to as cover for something far more calculated. Either way, I cannot allow suspicion of this magnitude to continue unresolved. You will be confined to the castle dungeons while a full investigation is conducted into your activities and associations. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gathered court, and Elena felt the walls closing in around her, the careful world she had built over the past weeks, threatening to collapse entirely in a single devastating moment. She thought quickly, desperately, aware that confinement to the dungeons would almost certainly mean discovery of her Emberkin abilities, and likely far worse consequences beyond simple imprisonment. As two guards stepped forward to escort her toward the dungeons, Elena made a decision in the span of a single heartbeat, one that would irrevocably alter the course of everything that followed. She glanced toward the great hall's tall windows, calculating distance and possibility, with the same careful discipline Elwyn had spent weeks teaching her to summon under pressure. I am sorry, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the hall, before summoning every bit of the discipline and strength she had cultivated in secret over the past month. A sudden burst of controlled flame erupted from her palms, not aimed to harm, but enough to startle the guards approaching her and create a moment of chaos and confusion throughout the stunned great hall. Gasps and shouts erupted around her, as nobles scrambled backward in shock, and Damien rose from his seat with sudden, sharp alertness, his eyes widening as he witnessed proof of exactly the kind of concealed strength Garrick had suspected, but never truly proven. Elena did not wait to see his reaction fully. She turned and ran, using the chaos and confusion to slip through a side passage she had memorized during her weeks working within the castle, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fierce, desperate resolve. She found Mira and Callan waiting near the servants' entrance exactly where they had arranged to meet only hours earlier, having sensed that circumstances within the castle were growing too dangerous to delay their plans any further. Elwyn joined them moments later, having anticipated this very possibility, and prepared accordingly. It is time, Elwyn said simply, and together, under the cover of the chaos still unfolding within the great hall behind them, the small group slipped through the castle's outer gates and disappeared into the surrounding darkness, leaving behind the humiliation, the suspicion, and the cold cruelty of Ashenmoor Castle, for whatever uncertain future awaited them beyond its walls. They had barely reached the tree line beyond the castle's outer fields when the sound of horns echoed behind them, sharp and urgent, cutting through the night air. Torches began appearing along the castle walls, and Elena's heart sank as she realized how quickly Damien's guards had organized themselves in pursuit. They will send riders, Callan said grimly, glancing back toward the castle before pushing the group forward at a faster pace. We need to reach the river before they catch up. If we cross into the eastern woods, the terrain grows too dense for horses to follow easily. Elena's legs already ached from running, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she forced herself forward, following Callan's lead through unfamiliar terrain, lit only by scattered moonlight breaking through the clouds above. Mira stayed close beside her, occasionally reaching out to steady her when the uneven ground threatened to send her stumbling, while Elwyn moved ahead with surprising speed, for a woman of her age, clearly no stranger to moving quickly and quietly through darkened landscapes. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder behind them within minutes, confirming Callan's fear that riders had already been dispatched. Faster, he urged, veering the group toward a narrow gap between two large boulders that Elena would never have noticed on her own. Through here, it leads down toward the riverbank. They scrambled down a steep, rocky slope, Elena catching herself against jagged stone more than once, small cuts stinging across her palms as she pushed forward without slowing. Behind them, shouts rang out through the darkness, confirming that the pursuing riders had spotted some sign of their passage, whether broken branches or disturbed earth marking their desperate flight. The river came into view moments later, wide and dark, moving swiftly beneath the moonlight. Callan did not hesitate, wading immediately into the cold water, and gesturing urgently for the others to follow. Elena felt the shock of the frigid current the moment she stepped in, the cold stealing the breath from her lungs, but she pushed forward regardless, focused entirely on reaching the opposite bank before the pursuing guards closed the distance further. Halfway across, the current grew stronger, pulling at her skirts and threatening to sweep her from her feet entirely. She fought against it with fierce determination, aware of Mira struggling nearby, and Elowen moving with careful, practiced steps despite her age. Callan reached back at one point, gripping Elena's arm firmly, to steady her against a particularly strong surge of current, and she felt a rush of gratitude even amid the terror of their desperate crossing. They reached the opposite bank soaked and shivering, scrambling up the muddy embankment, just as torchlight appeared along the riverbank they had left behind. Voices called out across the water, guards clearly searching the darkness for any sign of their escaped quarry, though the river's width and the darkness of the night worked in their favor, obscuring their small group as they pressed themselves low against the tall grass lining the far bank. "We cannot stop here," Elowen whispered, once the torchlight along the opposite bank began moving further downstream, the guards apparently searching for a crossing point of their own. "We need distance before dawn breaks. Come." They pushed onward through the remainder of the night, exhaustion weighing heavily against each of them, yet fear of capture proving a powerful motivator against any temptation to rest. By the time the first pale light of dawn began creeping across the eastern horizon, they had traveled several miles beyond the river, deep into unfamiliar woodland far from any road or settlement Elena recognized. Finally, as the sun rose fully above the horizon, Callan called a halt within a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, judging the location defensible enough to risk a brief rest. Elena sank down against the base of a large oak, her entire body aching with exhaustion, her damp clothes clinging uncomfortably against her skin in the cool morning air. "We made it," Mira said quietly, settling down beside her, though her voice carried more exhaustion than triumph. For now, at least. Elena nodded, staring back in the direction of the castle they had fled, now hidden far beyond the dense tree line surrounding their small clearing. She thought of the great hall, of Damien's stunned expression, as her flames erupted before the entire court, proof at last of exactly what Lord Garrick had suspected, but never confirmed. There would be no returning to Ashenmore Castle now, not as the humiliated servant girl who had once entered its gates hoping desperately for peace between two broken kingdoms. Whatever came next, Elena understood with quiet, exhausted clarity. The path ahead would require far more than simple survival. She glanced toward Elowen, who sat nearby, watching the surrounding trees with careful, alert eyes despite her own visible exhaustion.
"Where do we go from here?"
Elena asked quietly, once she had caught enough breath to speak clearly. Elowen turned toward her, studying her for a long moment before answering. "To the old lands," she said. "To whatever remains of the territories where the Emberkin once held influence and strength. It will be a difficult journey, Elena, filled with uncertainty and danger at every turn. But it is the only path that offers any true hope of reclaiming what your family lost, and of ensuring that this time, when danger finds you again, as it surely will, you face it not as a frightened servant fleeing through darkened woods, but as someone strong enough to stand fully in her own power." Elena closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from Elowen's steady confidence, despite the exhaustion and uncertainty pressing heavily against her. When she opened them again, she found Callan and Mira watching her with quiet, unwavering loyalty, two people who had risked everything to stand beside her through the chaos of the past night's escape. Whatever fear lingered within her regarding the uncertain road ahead, she was no longer facing it entirely alone, and that realization alone gave her the strength to rise from the base of the old oak tree, brushing dirt and damp leaves from her ruined dress, ready to continue the journey that had truly begun, the moment Alpha King Damien Ashgrove had first sent her to eat among the servants, never imagining the fire that single act of cruelty would eventually ignite. Rain hammered against the canvas tent that Callan had constructed from salvaged materials, the fourth such shelter he had built during their 11 days of travel since fleeing Ashenmore Castle. Elena sat huddled near a small fire, wrapped in a blanket that had grown increasingly threadbare with use, watching the flames dance, and remembering how differently she now viewed fire compared to when their journey first began. "We should reach the border of the old territories within 2 more days, Elowen said, studying a worn map spread across her lap, its edges frayed from constant handling. "Assuming the weather does not slow us further, and assuming we encounter no further trouble along the way." Elena nodded, though privately she wondered how many more days of hard travel her body could endure. The past 11 days had tested her in ways the castle kitchens never had, sleeping on hard ground, rationing scarce food carefully between the four of them, and constantly watching the horizon for any sign of pursuing riders sent by Damien's court. Twice already they had been forced to alter their route entirely upon spotting distant patrols, adding precious days to a journey that already felt endless. Mira stirred the small pot hanging above their fire, checking on the thin stew they had managed to prepare from foraged roots and the last of their dried meat. "It will not be much of a meal," she said apologetically, "but it will keep us moving another day." Callan returned to the small camp, just as the stew finished cooking, having spent the past hour scouting the surrounding area for any sign of danger. "All clear," he reported, settling down near the fire and accepting a bowl of stew gratefully. "Though I did find fresh tracks near the ridge to the north. Wolves, most likely, not soldiers, but worth remaining cautious about regardless." As they ate their meager meal in the flickering firelight, Elena found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first humiliating night in the great hall of Ashenmore Castle. She had arrived at that castle believing herself powerless, dependent entirely on a king's mercy for whatever future awaited her. Now, weeks later, sitting in a makeshift camp deep within unfamiliar wilderness, she felt something entirely different taking root within her, a stubborn, quiet strength that no amount of hardship along this difficult journey seemed capable of extinguishing. That night, after Mira and Callan had fallen into exhausted sleep, Elena remained awake beside the dying fire, unable to quiet the restless thoughts churning through her mind. Elowyn joined her quietly, settling down nearby, with the careful movements of someone whose joints ached from days of difficult travel. "You are troubled tonight," Elowyn observed, studying Elena's tired but alert expression in the dim firelight. "I keep thinking about what waits for us at the old territories," Elena admitted quietly. "What if there is nothing left there, Elowyn? What if generations of scattering and hiding have erased any true trace of Emberkin history or strength? I do not wish to have led Mira and Callan on this dangerous journey, only to discover we have chased nothing more than old legends and empty ruins." Elowyn considered the question carefully before responding. "I cannot promise you certainty," she said honestly. "I have not walked those lands myself in many years, and much may have changed in that time, but I can promise you this, Elena. Whatever remains there, ruins or otherwise, the strength you have already discovered within yourself is not dependent entirely on what we find. You have already proven, through everything you have endured these past weeks, that you carry real strength within you, strength that exists regardless of whether ancient ruins confirm or deny it." Elena absorbed these words carefully, drawing quiet comfort from her mentor's steady confidence, even amid her own uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know how I would have survived any of this without your guidance." "You would have found a way," Elowyn said with a faint smile. "I have simply had the privilege of helping you find it a bit sooner than you might have otherwise." The following 2 days of travel proved as difficult as Elowyn had anticipated, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they moved closer toward the border of the old Emberkin territories. Steep hillsides gave way to rocky outcroppings that demanded careful navigation, and the weather remained stubbornly uncooperative, alternating between heavy rain and bitter cold winds that tested the group's endurance at every turn. On the morning of their 13th day since fleeing the castle, they finally crested a tall ridge overlooking a wide valley below, and Elowyn stopped abruptly, staring down at the landscape with an expression Elena had never seen cross her mentor's face before, something between grief and cautious hope. "We have arrived," Elowyn said quietly. "This is the beginning of the old Emberkin territories." Elena moved to stand beside her, studying the valley stretched out below them. Unlike the well-maintained lands surrounding Ashenmore Castle, this valley showed clear signs of long abandonment, overgrown fields, crumbling structures barely visible through thick vegetation, and an unusual quiet that seemed to hang heavily over the entire landscape, despite the presence of scattered wildlife moving through the tall grass. "It looks deserted," Callan observed, joining them at the ridge with Mira close behind. "Not entirely," Elowyn said, pointing toward a thin trail of smoke rising from somewhere deeper within the valley, barely visible against the gray morning sky. "Someone still lives here, even after all these years." They made their way carefully down into the valley, moving with cautious alertness, given the uncertainty of what or who they might encounter. As they drew closer to the source of the distant smoke, they discovered a small settlement, no more than a dozen modest structures arranged around a central clearing, clearly built from salvaged materials scavenged from the surrounding ruins rather than proper construction. A handful of figures emerged from the settlement as they approached, watching the newcomers with wary, guarded expressions. An older man stepped forward from the group, his weathered face carrying deep lines that spoke of hardship endured over many years, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elowin with sudden, sharp recognition. "Elowin," he said slowly, disbelief coloring his weathered voice. "Is it truly you, after all these years?" Elowin's composure broke slightly at the sound of her own name spoken with such evident familiarity, her eyes widening with surprised recognition of her own. "Bramwell," she breathed. "I feared you had not survived the scattering." The old man named Bramwell stepped closer, studying the rest of the group with obvious curiosity, his gaze eventually settling on Elena with particular intensity. "And who have you brought with you?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of cautious hope. Elowin placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder, drawing her forward slightly. "This is Elena," she said, her voice carrying quiet significance, "a true descendant of the Emberkin bloodline." A murmur passed through the small group of settlement residents who had gathered to witness the exchange, disbelief and cautious excitement evident on several faces. Bramwell studied Elena with renewed intensity, his weathered features shifting through a complex mixture of emotions before finally settling into something resembling careful hope. "We had begun to believe the bloodline had truly ended," he said quietly, "that the scattering our people endured generations ago had finally succeeded in erasing us entirely from these lands." He turned to address the small gathered crowd. "This changes things. This changes everything we have hoped for since the day our ancestors were driven from these territories." Elena felt the weight of dozens of curious, hopeful eyes settling upon her, and for a moment, the responsibility implicit in their attention threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She glanced toward Elowin, seeking some measure of guidance amid the sudden, unexpected significance of their arrival. Elowin met her gaze steadily, offering a small, encouraging nod. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly, for Elena's ears alone. "What you do next will shape far more than your own future, Elena. It will shape the future of everyone who has waited, hidden and scattered, for a chance to reclaim what was stolen from them generations ago." That evening, as Bramwell and the small settlement's residents prepared a modest feast to welcome the unexpected arrivals, Elena found herself walking alone through the edges of the ruined valley, studying the crumbling remains of what had once clearly been a thriving territory before its destruction generations earlier. Broken stone foundations hinted at buildings that must have once stood tall and proud, and faded carvings along scattered fragments of stone walls depicted spiraling flame patterns similar to the mark that had appeared on her own forearm weeks earlier during her first meeting with Elowin. She paused before one particularly large fragment of carved stone, tracing her fingers gently along the weathered spiral pattern, feeling a strange, profound connection to a history she had known nothing about only weeks earlier. This had been her family's true legacy, buried and hidden for generations out of necessity and fear, waiting patiently for someone willing to reclaim it. Footsteps approached from behind, and Elena turned to find Mira and Callan joining her among the ruins, both studying the ancient carvings with quiet fascination. "This is a lot to take in," Mira said softly, running her own fingers along a different section of carved stone nearby. "It is," Elena agreed. "I came here hoping simply to understand more about my bloodline, perhaps to find safety and training beyond the reach of Damien's court. I did not expect to find an entire community who has waited generations for someone like me to walk through these ruins." Callan studied her carefully, his scarred features unusually thoughtful in the fading evening light. "Perhaps that is precisely why you were meant to find this place," he said. "Sometimes the path we set out upon leads us somewhere far more significant than we ever intended to travel." Elena considered his words carefully, gazing out across the ruined valley as the sun began setting behind distant hills, casting long shadows across broken stone and overgrown fields that had once, generations ago, belonged fully to her ancestors. Whatever uncertainty had lingered within her since fleeing Ashenmoor Castle nearly 2 weeks earlier began settling into something firmer, more resolute, as she stood among the ruins of her true heritage for the first time in her life. Tomorrow, she decided quietly, Watching the last light of sunset fade across the valley, she would begin learning everything Bramwell and the other settlement residents could teach her about the history and strength of the Emberkin bloodline. Whatever path lay ahead of her, whatever eventual reckoning awaited between herself and the Alpha King who had humiliated her so completely weeks earlier, she intended to walk that path fully prepared, carrying not only her own strength, but the accumulated hope and history of an entire scattered people, finally given reason to believe their legacy might yet be reclaimed. The modest feast prepared that evening felt, to Elena, far grander than any banquet she had attended within the halls of Ashenmore Castle, despite consisting of little more than roasted game, foraged vegetables, and simple bread baked over an open fire. What the meal lacked in refinement, it made up for entirely in warmth. The small settlement's residents gathering around several fires, scattered throughout the central clearing, sharing stories and laughter that carried none of the cold formality Elena had grown accustomed to among Damien's court. Bramwell settled beside Elena partway through the evening, studying her with the careful, measuring gaze of someone accustomed to leadership responsibilities. "Tell me of your journey here," he said. "Elowyn has shared only fragments, and I suspect there is a great deal more to your story than she has revealed." Elena spent the following hour recounting her arrival at Ashenmore Castle, the humiliation she suffered at the Great Hall, her weeks working among the servants, her discovery of the ancient book in the library, and finally, her secret training with Elowyn and their desperate escape from the castle, following false accusations orchestrated by Lord Garrick. Bramwell listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as her account unfolded. "This Alpha King sounds much like the rulers who drove our ancestors from these lands generations ago," he said once Elena finished her story. "Cruelty disguised as strength, suspicion mistaken for wisdom. It seems little has changed in the territories beyond these hidden valleys, despite the passing of so many years." "Perhaps it is time something changed," Elena said quietly, surprising herself slightly with the conviction carried in her own voice. Bramwell studied her carefully, something like cautious approval crossing his weathered features. "Perhaps it is," he agreed, "though such change rarely comes easily, or without significant cost." As the evening progressed, Elena found herself drawn into conversation with several other settlement residents, each carrying their own fragments of Emberkin history, passed down through careful oral tradition, despite the scattering their ancestors had endured. She learned of old customs once practiced throughout the territories, celebrations tied to seasonal fire rituals, methods of governance that had balanced individual strength with communal responsibility, and stories of legendary Emberkin ancestors whose deeds had shaped the surrounding territories, long before the coalition of rival packs had driven them into hiding. A young woman named Rosalind, perhaps a few years older than Elena herself, described growing up within the hidden settlement, never quite believing the old stories of Emberkin strength were anything more than comforting legend, meant to preserve a sense of identity among a scattered and struggling people. "I always assumed the stories were exaggerated," Rosalind admitted, glancing toward Elena with open curiosity. "Meant to give us something to hold on to, even if the truth had long since faded into nothing more than memory. Seeing you here, hearing Elowyn confirm what you truly are, it changes everything I believed about my own heritage." "I understand that feeling more than you might realize," Elena replied. "I did not know anything about the Emberkin bloodline myself, until only a few months ago. My own family buried this history so thoroughly that I grew up believing my ancestry held nothing beyond ordinary misfortune and decline." Rosalind nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is what has kept our people safe, all these years," she said, "burying the truth so deeply that even those who carried it forward no longer recognized its significance. But burying strength does not mean it disappears entirely. It simply waits, patiently, for someone willing to dig it back up." Later that night, once the fires had burned low and most of the settlement had retired to their modest shelters, Elena remained awake beside the dying embers, joined once again by Elowyn, who seemed to sense her former pupil's continued restlessness, despite the successful arrival at their long journey's destination. "You seem troubled, even now," Elowyn observed. "I am grateful beyond words to have found this place," Elena admitted, "to have found people who understand, finally, what I am, and where I truly come from. But I cannot help wondering what comes next. This settlement is hidden, small, vulnerable. If Damien's forces ever discovered it, Or if word spread beyond these valleys of what remains here, I fear the consequences could be devastating. Elowen considered this carefully before responding. That fear is not unfounded, she said. Hidden places remain hidden only so long as no one has reason to search for them. But perhaps, Elena, the answer is not simply remaining hidden forever, waiting anxiously for discovery that may eventually prove inevitable regardless. Perhaps the answer lies in growing strong enough and gathering enough support that hiding is no longer the only option available to your people. You mean building something larger? Elena said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape within her thoughts. Uniting scattered Emberkin descendants, and perhaps others who have suffered under kingdoms like Damien's, into something capable of standing openly, rather than hiding indefinitely. It is only one possible path, Elowen said carefully. A difficult one, certainly, and not without significant risk. But you have already shown remarkable capacity for growth and courage in the short time since your training began. I do not believe such a path is beyond your capability, should you choose to pursue it. Elena stared into the dying embers before her, turning the possibility over carefully within her mind. She thought of the small settlement surrounding her, hidden and vulnerable despite the quiet resilience of its residents. She thought of the countless other scattered communities that likely existed throughout the territories, descendants of families broken and displaced by kingdoms like Damien's, waiting perhaps without even realizing it, for something or someone capable of drawing them together into a force too strong to be dismissed or destroyed. Tomorrow, she said finally, her voice carrying quiet but unmistakable resolve, I would like to learn everything Bramwell and the others can teach me about the old Emberkin territories, and about any other communities who might still remain scattered throughout these lands. If there is truly a path toward building something larger than simple survival, I intend to find it, no matter how long the effort requires, or how difficult the road ahead proves to be. Elowen smiled, a rare expression of genuine warmth crossing her weathered features in the dim firelight. Then rest tonight, she said gently. Tomorrow, your true work begins. 6 months had passed since Elena first walked among the ruins of the old Emberkin territories, and the small hidden settlement that once housed barely a dozen families had grown into something Bramwell himself admitted he never expected to witness within his lifetime. Word of Elena's arrival, carefully and cautiously spread through trusted contacts among scattered communities throughout the surrounding territories, had drawn a slow but steady stream of new arrivals, each carrying their own fragments of buried heritage, their own stories of hardship endured under kingdoms that valued strength over compassion. Elena stood now at the edge of what had once been empty, overgrown fields, watching as dozens of settlement residents worked together constructing new shelters and clearing land for the coming planting season. The transformation still felt surreal to her some mornings, remembering how she had arrived in this valley exhausted and uncertain, and now found herself regarded by many as something between a symbol of hope and an emerging leader whose guidance shaped decisions affecting an entire growing community. You look deep in thought, Callan observed, joining her at the field's edge, his once scarred and weathered appearance now carrying a renewed vitality that suited the purposeful work he had taken on training the settlement's growing number of capable defenders. Simply reflecting on how much has changed, Elena admitted. 6 months ago, I could barely summon a controlled flame without Elowen's guidance. Now I am expected to help lead decisions that affect the safety and future of dozens of families. You have handled that responsibility with more wisdom than most leaders twice your age, Callan said sincerely. The settlement trusts you, Elena, not simply because of your bloodline, but because you have proven yourself willing to listen, to learn, and to work alongside everyone here, rather than simply commanding from a distance. Elena appreciated his words, though the weight of responsibility still occasionally felt overwhelming, particularly as the settlement continued growing in both size and visibility. What had begun as a small, carefully hidden community, now stretched across a significant portion of the valley, and maintaining secrecy while accommodating continued growth, had become an increasingly delicate balance. That afternoon, Elena gathered with Elowen, Bramwell, and several other settlement leaders within the modest central hall that had been constructed over the preceding months, serving as both meeting space and informal council chamber for decisions affecting the growing community. Mira, who had taken on responsibility for coordinating food supplies and resource distribution across the settlement, joined the gathering as well, her organizational skills proving invaluable as their numbers continued expanding. We have received word of 2 more communities willing to consider joining us, Bramwell reported, spreading a hand-drawn map across the central table, marked with small symbols indicating known settlements scattered throughout the surrounding territories. One near the eastern ridge, families descended from a pack driven from their lands nearly a generation ago. Another further south, closer to contested border territory, currently suffering under increasingly harsh treatment from a neighboring kingdom's expanding influence. Elena studied the map carefully, noting how many scattered communities existed throughout the region, each isolated and vulnerable in their own right, yet potentially powerful if properly united into something larger. "How many total communities have we identified at this point?" she asked. "Nearly 15, across the surrounding territories," Eloin answered, "though not all have expressed willingness to consider joining our efforts. Some remain too fearful of drawing attention from kingdoms like Damien's. Others have grown too accustomed to isolation, to easily trust outside cooperation, even among those who share similar heritage and hardship." "That fear is understandable," Elena said thoughtfully. "We cannot force cooperation, nor should we wish to. But perhaps we can demonstrate, through our own growth and success here, that unity offers genuine benefit, rather than simply additional risk." Mira nodded in agreement. "Word has already begun spreading naturally," she added. "Traders passing through nearby regions have noticed our growing settlement, and while we have been careful about what information we share, some rumors of a hidden community, offering safety and support, have apparently reached beyond our immediate territory already." This raised a concern that had weighed increasingly on Elena's mind in recent weeks. "That kind of attention carries real danger alongside potential benefit," she said carefully. "If rumors reach the wrong ears, particularly anyone connected to Damien's court, our continued secrecy becomes increasingly difficult to maintain." Bramwell considered this seriously before responding. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the time is approaching when secrecy alone will no longer serve our purposes effectively. We have grown strong enough now to offer real protection and support to those who join us. Perhaps continuing to hide entirely, rather than cautiously extending our influence and building genuine strength capable of deterring aggression, leaves us more vulnerable rather than less." The council discussion continued late into the afternoon, weighing carefully the risks and benefits of expanding their outreach efforts more openly, versus maintaining strict secrecy at the cost of slower, more cautious growth. Elena listened carefully to each perspective offered, aware that whatever direction they chose would carry significant consequences for the safety and future of everyone, now depending on the community they had built together. Ultimately, the council agreed on a measured approach, continuing careful, selective outreach to scattered communities, identified through trusted contacts, while simultaneously investing greater effort into strengthening their own defenses and training capable defenders, should their growing settlement eventually draw unwanted attention, despite their continued caution. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself traveling more frequently beyond the settlement's borders, accompanied always by Callan and a small group of trusted defenders, meeting with leaders of neighboring communities to build the careful trust necessary for eventual cooperation. Each journey brought new challenges and new understanding of just how widespread the hardship and displacement caused by kingdoms like Damien's truly extended throughout the surrounding territories. During one such journey to the Eastern Ridge community Bramwell had mentioned, Elena met an older woman named Cassandra, leader of a small pack who had endured particularly harsh treatment under a neighboring kingdom's expanding territorial ambitions. Cassandra listened carefully as Elena explained the growing settlement and the possibility of eventual cooperation between their communities, her expression carrying the careful skepticism of someone who had learned through hard experience not to trust easily. "You speak convincingly, young one," Cassandra said once Elena finished her explanation. "But convincing words have led my people toward disappointment before. What guarantee can you offer that joining your settlement would not simply trade one set of dangers for another?" Elena considered the question seriously before responding. "I cannot offer perfect guarantees," she admitted honestly. "Any path forward carries risk, and I would be dishonest to claim otherwise. What I can offer is this: our settlement has grown through mutual support and shared responsibility, not through demanding blind loyalty or offering false promises. Come see for yourself before making any decision. Speak with those who have already joined us. Judge for yourself whether what we have built together holds genuine value, or whether it is simply empty words offered by someone eager to expand her own influence." Cassandra studied Elena carefully for a long moment, something shifting slightly in her guarded expression. "That is a fair offer," she said finally. "Perhaps fairer than most who have approached my people with promises of alliance in recent years. I will consider a visit, though I make no immediate commitments beyond that." It was a small victory, but Elena understood that trust built slowly, through demonstrated consistency and genuine partnership, would ultimately prove far more valuable than hasty alliances formed through empty promises alone. She thanked Cassandra sincerely and continued her journey homeward, aware that the path toward building something capable of eventually challenging kingdoms like Damien's would require patience and careful effort, extending far beyond what she had initially anticipated when Elowin first suggested the possibility months earlier. By the time autumn began settling across the valley, painting the surrounding hillsides in shades of deep orange and gold, the settlement had grown to include representatives from nearly 6 additional communities, each contributing their own particular strengths and resources toward the collective effort taking shape within the valley. Cassandra's people, after her promised visit, confirmed the genuine nature of what Elena and the others had built, eventually joined as well, bringing with them valuable knowledge of defensive tactics developed through years of resisting encroachment from their aggressive neighboring kingdom. Elena continued her own training alongside these growing responsibilities, working closely with Elowin to deepen her control and understanding of the Emberkin strength continuing to develop within her. She discovered, through months of dedicated practice, that her abilities extended beyond simple manipulation of flame, tapping into deeper reserves of strength and resilience that seemed to grow stronger in direct correlation with her sense of purpose and responsibility toward the community steadily forming around her. One evening, as autumn's chill began settling deeply across the valley, Elena stood once more before the ancient carved stone fragments she had first discovered months earlier upon her arrival, tracing the spiraling flame patterns with fingers that now carried faint, permanent markings of her own, visible proof of how far her training and understanding had progressed since that first fateful meeting with Elowin, beneath an old oak tree, far beyond these valley walls. She thought, as she often did during these quiet evening moments, of Ashenmore Castle, of Damien's cold dismissal in the Great Hall, of Lord Garrick's calculating suspicion, of the desperate flight through darkened forests that had eventually led her toward this unexpected destiny unfolding before her. She did not yet know precisely what the future held, whether reconciliation, confrontation, or something else entirely awaited, whenever her path eventually crossed once more with the Alpha King, who had first sent her stumbling toward this unexpected transformation. But standing among the growing strength of a community, steadily rebuilding itself from generations of scattered hardship, Elena felt increasingly confident that whatever eventual reckoning awaited, she would face it not as a humiliated servant girl exiled to eat among strangers, but as someone capable of standing fully in her own reclaimed power, surrounded by allies who had chosen, freely and deliberately, to stand beside her. Her quiet reflection was interrupted by hurried footsteps approaching through the darkening evening light. She turned to find one of the settlement's younger defenders, a boy named Peter who had joined only weeks earlier, alongside Cassandra's people, running toward her with obvious urgency. "Elena," he called out, breathless from his run. "Callan sent me. We caught someone at the northern boundary, watching the settlement from the ridgeline. He is being questioned now, but Callan thought you should come immediately." Elena's heart quickened with sudden alarm, and she hurried alongside Peter back toward the settlement's central clearing, where a small crowd had already gathered near the northern edge of the community. Callan stood at the center of the gathering, along with 2 other defenders restraining a stranger whose clothing, though deliberately plain, carried subtle details Elena recognized immediately from her time within Ashenmore Castle, a particular style of stitching used by the kingdom's official scouts and messengers. "He carries no weapons beyond a hunting knife," Callan reported as Elena approached, "and he claims to be simply a traveler who lost his way. But I do not believe that explanation, Elena. He was watching the settlement for some time before we noticed him, counting our numbers, from what I could determine by his position along the ridge." Elena studied the stranger carefully, a young man perhaps only a few years older than herself, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension of his situation. "Who sent you?" she asked directly, her voice carrying quiet but unmistakable authority that had grown steadily over the preceding months of leadership within the settlement. The stranger hesitated, his eyes flickering briefly with something that might have been fear or calculation before he finally answered. I was traveling alone, he insisted. I saw smoke from your settlement and grew curious. That is the whole truth of it. Elena studied him a moment longer, then glanced toward Elowen, who had joined the gathering, and now watched the stranger with the same careful, measuring attention Elena remembered from her own early training months earlier. Elowen gave a small, subtle shake of her head, confirming Elena's own instinct that the stranger's explanation carried more falsehood than truth. We will not harm you, Elena said finally, softening her tone slightly, though maintaining firm authority. But we cannot simply release you if you continue offering explanations we both know are untrue. Tell us honestly who sent you, and why, and I promise you will be treated fairly regardless of the answer. The stranger's composure finally cracked slightly under her steady, patient pressure. I was sent from the border garrison, he admitted quietly. Word had reached Lord Garrick of rumors regarding a growing settlement somewhere within these old territories, possibly connected to descendants of an old bloodline thought extinguished generations ago. I was sent only to observe, to confirm or deny these rumors. I carry no orders beyond gathering information. A tense murmur passed through the gathered crowd at this confirmation of their worst fears. That word of their growing community had indeed reached Damien's court, specifically the calculating attention of Lord Garrick, who Elena remembered all too well from her time within the castle. She felt her pulse quicken with genuine alarm, aware of how quickly this development could threaten everything they had worked so carefully to build over the preceding months. Does Lord Garrick suspect specifically that I am among this settlement? Elena asked, keeping her voice steady, despite the anxiety tightening within her chest. The stranger hesitated again before answering. There have been whispers, he admitted. Rumors of a servant girl who escaped the castle under strange circumstances, capable of summoning flame. Whether Lord Garrick has connected those rumors directly to this settlement, I honestly do not know. My orders were simply to observe and report back what I found here. After further careful questioning yielded no additional useful information, the council gathered later that evening to discuss the implications of this unwelcome discovery. The stranger, whose name they eventually learned was Edric, remained under careful watch within the settlement, his fate still undecided, pending further discussion. This confirms what we feared, Bramwell said grimly. Once the council convened within the central hall, our growth has not gone entirely unnoticed, despite our continued caution. We must decide now how to respond to this threat, before Lord Garrick's suspicions solidify into direct action against us. Elena listened carefully as various council members debated potential responses, some advocating for immediate relocation of the entire settlement to a more remote and defensible location, others arguing that such drastic measures would undo months of careful growth and community building for a threat that remained, as yet, only speculative rather than confirmed. I do not believe relocation solves our underlying problem, Elena said finally, once the debate had continued for some time without clear resolution. Even if we move to a more remote location, our growth and visible presence will eventually draw similar attention again, particularly as our numbers continue increasing. Hiding indefinitely was never truly a sustainable solution, only a temporary measure, while we built the strength necessary for something more permanent. What do you propose instead? Cassandra asked, her sharp eyes studying Elena with careful attention. I propose we accelerate our preparations, Elena said, her voice growing steadier and more confident as she spoke. We continue our defensive training, continue reaching out carefully to additional communities willing to join our cause, and we begin preparing ourselves not simply to hide from Damien's kingdom indefinitely, but to eventually stand strong enough that his court has no choice but to acknowledge our presence and our strength, rather than simply attempting to crush us through force or intimidation. A thoughtful silence settled over the council following her words, several members exchanging considering glances before Bramwell finally spoke again. That is an ambitious path, Elena, he said carefully, and a dangerous one, should we misjudge our own readiness before Damien's forces move against us directly. I understand the danger, Elena said honestly, but I also understand that continuing to live in fear of eventual discovery, without actively preparing for that possibility, leaves us equally vulnerable, perhaps more so. If we are going to face this threat eventually, and I believe we are, I would rather face it prepared and united than caught off guard and scattered once again. The council ultimately agreed, cautiously, to Elena's proposed path forward, committing to accelerated training and continued careful expansion of their alliance with neighboring communities, while remaining vigilant against further scouts or spies who might attempt similar reconnaissance in the future. As for Edric, the captured scout, the council eventually decided to release him, though not before Elena spoke with him personally one final time. "You will return to Lord Garrick and report what you have seen here," she said, studying the young scout carefully. "I will not stop you, nor will I ask you to lie on our behalf. But I ask that you also tell him this. Tell him that the settlement he has heard rumors about does not hide out of weakness, but out of careful patience. Tell him that patience will not last forever, and that when it ends, we intend to stand as something far stronger than his court currently anticipates." Edric studied her carefully, something like grudging respect flickering briefly across his features before he nodded and departed the settlement under careful escort toward the valley's edge. Elena watched him go, aware that her message would almost certainly reach not only Lord Garrick, but likely Damien himself within a matter of days. As winter began settling across the valley in the weeks that followed, bringing with it harsh winds and the first heavy snowfall Elena had witnessed since her arrival months earlier, the settlement continued its accelerated preparations with renewed urgency, aware that whatever peace and secrecy they had enjoyed during their initial months of growth had likely reached its natural end. Elena continued her own training alongside Elwyn, with increased intensity as well, aware that whatever confrontation eventually awaited her, whether through diplomacy or through direct conflict, she needed to be fully prepared to meet it, carrying not only her own strength, but the accumulated hopes and resilience of everyone who had chosen to stand beside her throughout the difficult months since her humiliating departure from Ashenmore Castle. Snow crunched beneath Elena's boots as she moved through the training grounds carved into the valley's northern edge, her breath visible in the cold winter air as she practiced the disciplined forms Elwyn had taught her over the preceding weeks. Flame danced along her extended fingers, controlled and precise despite the biting cold surrounding her, a testament to how far her mastery had progressed since those first uncertain lessons beneath the old oak tree many months earlier. "Good," Elwyn called out from where she observed nearby, wrapped warmly against the winter chill. "Your control has grown remarkably steady. But control alone will not be enough should Damien's forces eventually move against this settlement directly. You must also learn to extend your strength beyond simple flame manipulation." Elena lowered her hands, extinguishing the controlled fire and turning toward her mentor with curious attention. "What do you mean?" she asked. "The old Emberkin texts speak of abilities beyond simple fire summoning," Elwyn explained, moving closer despite the cold biting at her weathered joints. "Heightened resilience against injury, increased physical strength during moments of true necessity. Even, in the most powerful documented cases, the ability to extend protective warmth to others nearby, shielding them from harm during moments of genuine crisis. These abilities do not come easily, Elena, and require a depth of internal discipline beyond simple technical mastery of flame." Over the following weeks, Elena's training expanded significantly beyond what she had previously practiced, pushing her physical and mental endurance in ways that tested her more thoroughly than any lesson before. She learned to draw upon deeper reserves of strength during moments of genuine physical strain, sparring extensively with Callan, who had grown skilled enough in recent months to challenge her properly without risking serious harm to either of them. During one particularly demanding session, as Elena struggled to maintain focus while Callan pressed her defenses with increasing intensity, she found herself growing frustrated by her continued inability to access the deeper reserves of strength Elwyn insisted existed within her. "Why can I summon flame with ease, yet struggle so thoroughly with these other abilities?" Elena demanded, during a brief pause in their training, frustration evident in her tightened voice. Elwyn, who had been observing quietly nearby, finally spoke. "Flame responds readily to focused will and emotion," she said. "These deeper abilities require something different, a genuine willingness to fully accept the responsibility your strength carries, not simply for yourself, but for everyone who depends upon you. Perhaps some part of you still hesitates to fully claim that responsibility." Elena considered these words carefully, recognizing an uncomfortable truth within them. Despite months of leadership within the growing settlement, despite the trust and loyalty she had earned from Bramwell, Cassandra, and dozens of others who now called this community home, some quiet part of her still doubted whether she truly deserved the significance others had placed upon her. still carried lingering echoes of that humiliated servant girl sent to eat among strangers within Ashenmore Castle's kitchens. That evening, Elena sought out Mira, finding her friend organizing supply stores within one of the settlement's larger storage buildings, her breath visible in the cold evening air despite the warm lantern light illuminating her work. "Can I speak with you honestly?" Elena asked, settling onto an overturned crate nearby. "Of course," Mira said, setting aside her work immediately, concern evident on her face. "What troubles you?" Elena hesitated, then finally voiced the doubt that had been growing steadily within her despite months of outward confidence and leadership. "Sometimes I wonder if I truly deserve everyone's trust here," she admitted quietly. "Bramwell speaks of me as though I carry the fate of our entire people upon my shoulders. Cassandra and the others who have joined us have risked everything, based on faith in my leadership. Yet some part of me still feels like that frightened girl who arrived at Damien's castle, uncertain and easily humiliated. What if I am not truly capable of carrying what everyone here has placed upon me?" Mira listened carefully, her expression softening with genuine understanding, rather than dismissal of Elena's concerns. "Elena," she said gently, "doubt does not mean you are unworthy of the trust others have placed in you. If anything, it means you understand fully the weight of that responsibility, rather than dismissing it carelessly. I have watched you grow enormously these past months, not simply in strength, but in wisdom and genuine care for everyone within this settlement. The girl who arrived at that castle months ago would not have built what you have built here. She would not have earned the loyalty you now carry." Elena absorbed her friend's words carefully, feeling some measure of the doubt within her ease slightly, though not entirely disappear. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I needed to hear that, more than I realized." As winter deepened further across the valley, bringing increasingly harsh weather that tested the settlement's preparations and resources, a new challenge emerged from within the community itself, one that Elena had not fully anticipated despite months of careful leadership. A man named Roderick, who had joined the settlement several months earlier, alongside a small group from a distant community, began quietly voicing dissatisfaction with the direction Elena and the council had chosen, particularly regarding the accelerated preparations undertaken since Edric's capture and release. Elena first became aware of the growing discontent when Bramwell approached her privately, following a council meeting, his expression carrying uncharacteristic concern. "There are whispers spreading among some newer arrivals," he said quietly. "Roderick has been suggesting that our current path leads inevitably toward direct conflict with Damien's kingdom. Conflict he believes we are not truly prepared to survive. He argues we should instead seek quiet accommodation, perhaps even offering information about our settlement in exchange for guaranteed safety from the kingdom's forces." Elena felt a cold unease settle through her at this news. "Accommodation with a kingdom that has shown nothing but cruelty toward those it considers beneath its notice," she said carefully. "That seems an unlikely path toward genuine safety. Roderick argues that continued preparation for conflict only increases the likelihood that conflict eventually occurs," Bramwell explained. "He believes quiet submission offers a safer path than open resistance, particularly given how young and inexperienced our defensive capabilities remain, compared to an established kingdom's full military strength." Elena requested a private meeting with Roderick that same evening, hoping to understand his concerns directly, rather than relying solely on second-hand reports. She found him within his modest shelter, a man perhaps in his middle years, his expression guarded, but not openly hostile as she entered. "I understand you carry concerns about our current path," Elena said directly, settling across from him without preamble. "I would rather hear them from you directly than through rumors passed second-hand through the settlement." Roderick studied her for a long moment before responding. "My concerns are simple," he said. "You are young, Elena Hartwell, younger than most who carry the kind of responsibility you have taken upon yourself. I do not doubt your strength, nor your good intentions, but intentions alone do not protect against an established kingdom's military might, should Damien eventually decide our growing settlement represents a genuine threat requiring elimination rather than simple observation." "What alternative do you propose?" Elena asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral despite the challenge implicit in his words. "Quiet negotiation," Roderick answered, offering the kingdom assurance that our settlement poses no threat to their authority, in exchange for being left in peace. "Perhaps even offering information regarding your own location and abilities, if it guarantees safety for the majority of settlement residents who bear no direct connection to your particular bloodline or history with the king. Elena felt a flash of anger at the implicit suggestion, quickly controlled but unmistakable in her steady response. You are suggesting I should be offered as a sacrifice to purchase safety for everyone else, she said quietly. I am suggesting that difficult choices sometimes require difficult sacrifices, Roderick replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. I do not say this out of malice toward you, Elena. I say it because I have watched kingdoms like Damien's crush resistance before, and I have no wish to see this community destroyed, chasing a dream of unity and strength that may prove impossible to achieve against such established power. The conversation left Elena deeply troubled, recognizing that Roderick's fears, however uncomfortable his proposed solution, reflected genuine concerns that likely existed among other settlement residents as well, even those unwilling to voice such doubts openly. She brought the matter before the full council the following day, believing that open, honest discussion offered a better path forward than allowing quiet dissent to fester unaddressed beneath the surface of their community. The council meeting proved lengthy and difficult, with various members voicing a range of perspectives regarding the settlement's current path and the risks involved in continuing their preparations for eventual confrontation with Damien's kingdom. Elena listened carefully to each perspective, resisting the urge to dismiss concerns simply because they challenged the path she herself believed necessary. Ultimately, she addressed the full gathered council directly, her voice carrying quiet but firm conviction. I understand the fear-driving suggestions of accommodation or negotiation, she said. I do not dismiss that fear as unfounded, nor do I claim certainty regarding the eventual outcome of the path we currently pursue. But I do not believe quiet submission offers genuine safety, not to myself, and not to any of you. Kingdoms that rule through cruelty and suspicion, as Damien's does, rarely honor promises of peace offered to those they consider beneath genuine respect. I believe our only true path toward lasting safety lies in building strength sufficient to command that respect, rather than hoping quiet submission earns mercy that history suggests rarely comes. She paused, studying the gathered faces around her carefully before continuing. I will not force anyone to remain part of this path if they genuinely believe accommodation offers better safety for themselves and their families. Anyone who wishes to leave, to seek a different path forward, may do so freely, without judgment or resentment from myself or this council. But I will continue building the strength and unity necessary to eventually stand openly against the kind of cruelty that first sent me fleeing from Ashenmore Castle. And I hope that many of you will choose to continue standing beside me as we pursue that path together. A heavy silence followed her words, broken eventually by Cassandra, who rose from her seat with quiet but unmistakable determination. I did not travel from the Eastern Ridge, nor bring my people to join this settlement, simply to abandon the fight when circumstances grow difficult, she said firmly. I stand with Elena, and I believe most who have joined this community share that same conviction, whatever fears we may carry alongside our resolve. Similar expressions of continued support followed from Bramwell and several other council members, and though Roderick and a small handful of others ultimately chose to depart the settlement peacefully in the following days, seeking whatever accommodation they believed might offer safer prospects elsewhere, the majority of the community remained united behind the path Elena had proposed, their resolve, if anything, strengthened rather than diminished by the honest confrontation of their shared fears and doubts. As the difficult winter months continued, Elena found her own doubts gradually settling into something closer to steady, hard-won confidence, forged through the genuine testing of her leadership and the continued loyalty demonstrated by those who chose, freely and deliberately, to remain committed to the path they were building together. She continued her training with renewed intensity as well, finally beginning to access the deeper reserves of strength Elowen had spoken of months earlier, no longer held back by lingering doubt regarding whether she truly deserved the responsibility and trust placed upon her by the growing community she now led. Whatever confrontation eventually awaited with Damien's kingdom, Elena understood with increasing clarity that she would face it not alone, and not as a hesitant leader still questioning her own worth, but as someone finally, fully prepared to claim the strength and purpose that had been steadily awakening within her since that first humiliating night many months earlier. The true test of this newfound confidence arrived unexpectedly, nearly 3 weeks after Roderick's departure, when a severe winter storm swept through the valley, with a ferocity none of the settlement's longtime residents could recall experiencing in recent memory. Heavy snow fell for 2 continuous days, accompanied by bitter winds that threatened several of the settlement's less sturdy structures. And on the storm's second night, disaster struck when a section of the main grain storage building collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, trapping several people inside, including young Peter and 2 children who had been helping him retrieve supplies before the collapse occurred. Elena was among the first to reach the wreckage, alerted by frantic shouts cutting through the howling wind. "Rescuers, move carefully," Callan called out, already directing settlement residents to begin clearing debris, but the danger was immediately apparent, the remaining structure groaning ominously under continued strain, threatening further collapse onto anyone attempting to reach those trapped within. "We do not have time for careful," Elena said, moving toward the wreckage despite Callan's alarmed protest. She could hear muffled cries from within, growing weaker with each passing moment, as cold and fear took their toll on those trapped beneath the debris. Closing her eyes briefly, Elena drew upon every lesson Elowen had taught her over the preceding months, reaching not simply for the familiar flame that danced readily at her command, but for the deeper reserves of strength her mentor had insisted existed within her, strength she had struggled for weeks to fully access. She felt something shift within her chest, a warmth spreading rapidly through her limbs, unlike anything she had experienced during her earlier, more controlled training exercises. With strength that surprised even herself, Elena began pulling away heavy sections of collapsed timber and packed snow, her movements carrying a power and endurance far beyond what her earlier months of training alone would have suggested possible. Around her, other settlement residents joined the effort, inspired by her determined example, working together to clear a path toward the trapped survivors, as the structure continued its ominous groaning above them. Reaching Peter and the 2 frightened children finally, huddled together beneath a partially collapsed support beam that had fortunately created just enough space to protect them from the worst of the debris, Elena felt fresh urgency as she recognized the youngest child shivering violently, dangerously close to succumbing fully to the bitter cold surrounding them. Without conscious thought, driven purely by instinct and desperate need, Elena reached out and drew the frightened child close against her, and warmth immediately radiated outward from her embrace, a controlled, steady heat that pushed back against the killing cold surrounding them, precisely the protective ability Elowen had described months earlier, but that Elena had never successfully summoned during deliberate practice. "We need to move quickly," she said, gathering the child securely, while Callan and others helped Peter and the second child free from the remaining debris. Together, they made their way back through the storm toward the settlement's central hall, where warm fires and dry blankets waited to receive the rescued survivors. By the time the storm finally passed 2 days later, leaving the valley blanketed beneath deep, undisturbed snow, all those trapped within the collapsed storage building had recovered fully, their survival owed in significant part to Elena's desperate breakthrough during the crisis. Word of her actions spread quickly throughout the settlement, and the lingering doubts some residents had privately carried regarding her youth and readiness for leadership faded considerably in the face of such clear, undeniable demonstration of both her growing abilities and her genuine willingness to risk everything, protecting those who depended upon her. Elowen found Elena resting near the central hall's main fire that evening, watching quietly as she finished sharing a warm meal with Peter and the children she had helped rescue days earlier. "You finally accessed what I spoke of months ago," Elowen observed, settling down beside her former student with quiet satisfaction. "Not through careful practice or deliberate technique, but through genuine necessity and selfless instinct. That is often how true mastery finally reveals itself, Elena, in the moments we stop questioning whether we deserve our own strength and simply act from the deepest truth of who we have become." Elena considered her mentor's words carefully, feeling the last remnants of her earlier doubt finally settling into quiet, hard-won confidence. "I do not think I fully believed I was ready. Until that moment," she admitted. "Until there was no room left for doubt, only the necessity of protecting those who needed me. Perhaps that is precisely when true readiness reveals itself," Elowen said gently, "not in the absence of doubt, but in the willingness to act fully despite it, when circumstances demand nothing less." As Elena finally retired that night, exhausted but carrying a settled confidence she had not fully possessed even weeks earlier, she found herself thinking, not for the first time, of Ashenmore Castle, and the eventual reckoning that surely still awaited beyond the valley's protective borders. Whatever news Edric had carried back to Lord Garrick and Damien months earlier, whatever preparations the kingdom might currently be undertaking, in response to rumors of a growing settlement within the old territories, Elena understood with quiet certainty that the confrontation, when it eventually arrived, would find her fully prepared. No longer the uncertain girl, who had once doubted whether she deserved the strength steadily growing within her, but someone who had proven, through genuine trial and selfless sacrifice, exactly the kind of leader capable of carrying her people's hopes forward into whatever difficult future still awaited them all. The great hall of Ashenmore Castle no longer echoed with the confident laughter that had once filled its stone walls during Damien's early years of rule. Instead, a heavy, uneasy silence had settled over the court in recent months, broken only by hushed conversations carried out in careful whispers among nobles who had grown increasingly wary of speaking openly regarding the kingdom's deteriorating circumstances. Damien sat alone in his private study, late one evening, staring at a stack of reports his stewards had delivered throughout the day, each carrying news more troubling than the last. Harvests across the eastern villages had fallen far short of previous years, worsened by the harsh winter, and further strained by tax collections that Lord Garrick continued insisting were necessary, despite growing unrest among the farming communities forced to bear their weight. Several border patrols had reported strange, unexplained activity within the old abandoned territories to the south, rumors of a growing settlement that continued to resist confirmation despite repeated attempts to investigate more thoroughly. A soft knock interrupted his troubled thoughts, and Lord Garrick entered without waiting for formal invitation, his expression carrying its usual calculated composure, though Damien had noticed increasing tension lining his advisor's features in recent weeks. "You wish to see the latest reports from the Southern Territories," Garrick said, placing a fresh document on the desk before him. Damien studied the report carefully, his frown deepening as he read through the details. "Another scout failed to return," he said flatly. "That makes 3 now, since Edric's initial report months ago." "It does," Garrick confirmed. "Whatever exists within those old territories, they have grown increasingly capable of protecting their secrecy. Edric's report suggested a settlement possibly connected to the old Emberkin bloodline, and possibly connected to the Hartwell girl who fled this castle months ago. If that connection proves accurate, my king, we may be facing something considerably more organized than simple scattered refugees seeking shelter in abandoned lands." Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of Elena, memories of that night in the great hall surfacing with an unwelcome clarity he had tried repeatedly to push aside in the months since her dramatic escape. He remembered the controlled burst of flame that had erupted from her hands before the assembled court, proof of exactly the kind of concealed strength Garrick had long suspected, but never definitively proven. He remembered too, though he rarely allowed himself to dwell on the thought, the steady defiance in her eyes when he had first humiliated her, before his entire court, a defiance that had never fully left his memory, despite months of attempting to dismiss its significance. "What do you recommend?" Damien asked finally, setting the report aside. "I recommend decisive action before this situation grows beyond our ability to control it," Garrick said firmly. "Send a significant force to the Southern Territories, sufficient to overwhelm whatever resistance we might encounter, and eliminate this potential threat before it has opportunity to grow further." Damien considered this recommendation carefully, though something within him hesitated, a reluctance he could not entirely explain even to himself. "Our resources are already strained," he said finally. "The eastern villages grow increasingly restless under continued tax burden, and diverting significant military strength toward an unconfirmed threat in the southern territories carries its own risks, should unrest elsewhere in the kingdom worsen in our absence." Garrick's expression tightened with obvious frustration, though he maintained careful composure befitting his position. "My king," he said, "if this settlement truly harbors the kind of strength Edric's report suggested, delay only allows that threat to grow stronger and more organized. The better to act decisively now, while whatever forces they have assembled likely remain smaller and less prepared than they will become given additional time." The debate continued for some time without clear resolution, and Damien eventually dismissed Garrick without committing fully to any particular course of action, his own uncertainty regarding the proper response weighing heavily against his advisor's persistent urging toward immediate military action. In the weeks that followed, however, circumstances within the kingdom itself began deteriorating further, adding additional pressure to Damien's already difficult decision. Reports arrived of growing unrest among the eastern villages, whispered talk of farmers refusing to pay increasingly burdensome taxes, and even isolated incidents of open resistance against Garrick's stewards sent to enforce collection. Damien found himself increasingly consumed by these internal challenges, his attention repeatedly pulled away from the unconfirmed rumors regarding the southern territories in favor of more immediate concerns threatening the stability of his own court and kingdom. During one particularly tense council meeting, as advisors argued over how best to address the growing unrest among the eastern farming communities, an elderly council member named Aldrich, who had served faithfully since Damien's father's reign, finally spoke words that few within the court had dared voice openly in recent months. "My king," Aldrich said carefully, "perhaps the growing unrest we face throughout this kingdom stems not simply from unfortunate circumstance, but from choices this court has made regarding how we treat those who depend upon our leadership. The tax burden placed upon the eastern villages exceeds what those communities can reasonably bear. The harsh treatment shown toward outsiders, and those perceived as weak or without proper standing, has bred resentment that now threatens to undermine the very stability we seek to protect." Damien studied the old advisor carefully, aware that Aldrich's words carried an implicit criticism few others within his court would risk voicing so directly. "Are you suggesting my leadership has caused these difficulties?" he asked, his tone carrying warning rather than open anger. "I am suggesting, my king, that leadership built primarily on fear and strict control, rather than genuine care for those it governs, often proves less stable than it initially appears," Aldrich said carefully. "Your father understood this balance well, even during difficult years of his own reign. I fear, in recent years, this court has drifted increasingly toward relying on fear alone, and fear, however effective in the short term, rarely sustains genuine loyalty over time." The council chamber fell into uncomfortable silence following Aldrich's words, several advisors exchanging uneasy glances, clearly uncertain how Damien would respond to such direct criticism. Damien himself remained quiet for a long moment, memories surfacing unbidden of his own father's more measured approach to leadership, memories he had largely set aside in the years since taking the throne, particularly following the personal loss that had reshaped his own approach toward ruling, with increasingly rigid control rather than genuine trust. "I will consider your words, Aldrich," Damien said finally, his tone carrying less anger than several council members had anticipated, "though I make no immediate promises regarding changes to our current approach." As the difficult weeks continued, however, evidence mounted further suggesting that Aldrich's warnings carried genuine merit. Reports arrived of small groups from the eastern villages abandoning their homes entirely, seeking uncertain futures elsewhere, rather than continuing to endure the kingdom's increasingly harsh treatment. Whispers spread through the castle's own servants' quarters as well, quiet talk among those who remembered Elena's harsh treatment months earlier, wondering aloud whether rumors of a hidden settlement to the south might offer better prospects than continued service within Ashenmore Castle's increasingly strained and unstable court. Mira's name, though Damien did not know it, occasionally surfaced in these quiet servant conversations, remembered fondly by those who recalled her kindness toward the humiliated bride sent to eat among the kitchen staff months earlier, and speculation grew increasingly common regarding whether she and others who had disappeared alongside Elena's escape had found genuine safety and purpose within whatever community continued growing beyond the kingdom's southern borders. Lord Garrick, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated by Damien's continued hesitation regarding decisive action against the suspected settlement, his own calculations suggesting that further delay only strengthened whatever threat might genuinely exist within the old territories. During a private meeting held without Damien's direct knowledge, Garrick met with several military commanders loyal specifically to his own authority within the court structure, discussing preliminary plans for a more limited scouting expedition, intended to gather concrete confirmation regarding the settlement's true strength and capabilities. Preparation for eventual larger action he intended to eventually convince Damien remained necessary regardless of the king's current hesitation. "This is a dangerous game you play," one commander cautioned Garrick privately, when others could not overhear their conversation. "Acting without the king's direct authorization carries significant risk, should he discover your independent planning. I act in the kingdom's genuine interest. Garrick replied firmly. The king's hesitation stems from sentiment rather than sound strategic judgment. Sentiment, I suspect, connects more closely to the Hartwell girl than he would ever openly admit. Someone within this court must ensure decisive action occurs before whatever threat continues growing in the South becomes too powerful to effectively counter. Unbeknownst to Garrick, however, word of his independent planning eventually reached Damien through a servant loyal enough to the crown to report unusual activity among the military commanders. Information that arrived just as Damien himself had begun seriously reconsidering his kingdom's current path, following weeks of mounting internal unrest, and Aldrich's persistent, quiet counsel regarding the dangers of leadership built primarily on fear. Confronting Garrick directly within his private study, Damien's expression carried a coldness that even his most trusted advisor had rarely witnessed, directed toward himself. "You have been planning military action without my authorization," he said flatly, no longer bothering to disguise the accusation as a question. Garrick, caught unprepared by the confrontation, attempted careful justification. "My king, I act only in the kingdom's best interest, given your continued hesitation regarding a genuine and growing threat." "Enough," Damien cut in sharply. "I have tolerated your influence over this court's daily operations for years, Garrick. Trust in your judgment regarding matters I found myself too consumed by other responsibilities to fully oversee. That trust, it seems, was misplaced, if you believe yourself entitled to plan military action, independent of my direct authority." The confrontation marked a significant turning point within Damien's court. Garrick's previously unquestioned influence suddenly and visibly diminished, as word of his independent scheming spread quietly among the remaining council members, several of whom had long harbored private reservations regarding his growing authority, but had lacked sufficient standing to challenge him openly. Damien, meanwhile, found himself increasingly forced to reckon directly with the accumulated consequences of years spent ruling through calculated distance and fear, rather than the more balanced approach his father had once demonstrated. Memories of Elena's steady defiance during that first humiliating encounter, resurfacing with uncomfortable frequency, as he considered the mounting evidence that his current path had led his kingdom toward genuine instability, rather than the lasting strength and security he had originally intended to build. A week after his confrontation with Garrick, Damien summoned Aldrich to his private study, seeking counsel he had previously dismissed too readily in favor of his own rigid judgment. The old advisor arrived promptly, settling into the chair across from the king, with the same careful patience he had shown throughout decades of faithful service. "I have been considering your words from the council chamber," Damien admitted, an unusual vulnerability coloring his tone. "About fear and genuine loyalty. I find myself increasingly unable to dismiss them, particularly given recent events within Garrick's independent scheming and the unrest continuing to spread through the eastern villages." Aldrich studied him carefully before responding. "What troubles you most, my king?" he asked gently. "The unrest itself, or what it suggests about the foundation this court has been built upon in recent years?" Damien considered the question honestly before answering. "Both," he admitted. "Though if I am truly honest, Aldrich, I find myself thinking more frequently of a young woman I humiliated publicly, months ago, simply because her family's misfortune offered a convenient target for cruelty I did not fully examine at the time. I have told myself since that her subsequent deception, her concealed abilities, justified my suspicion, but I begin to wonder whether my own cruelty planted the very seeds of distrust that eventually drove her toward concealment and flight in the first place." Aldrich remained quiet for a long moment, allowing the king space to sit with this uncomfortable reflection, before finally responding. "Cruelty rarely builds anything lasting, my king," he said gently, "whatever justification we construct around it in the moment. If this young woman has indeed built something significant beyond your borders, as growing rumors increasingly suggest, perhaps it stands as a testament not to some inherent danger within her, but to the genuine strength and leadership capable of emerging when someone is finally freed from the fear and suspicion that once sought to diminish them." Damien absorbed this counsel in troubled silence, memories of that first night in the great hall, replaying with uncomfortable clarity, Elena's steady voice thanking him for his hospitality, even as humiliation burned visibly beneath her composed exterior. He had told himself for months that her defiance that night reflected arrogance unworthy of respect. Now, considering Aldrich's words carefully, He began to wonder whether it had instead reflected a strength he had simply been too consumed by his own guarded distance to properly recognize. The kingdom's difficulties, meanwhile, continued deepening in the weeks that followed. Unrest in the eastern villages escalated further when a group of farmers, pushed beyond their limits by continued tax demands, despite an already meager harvest, openly refused entry to Garrick's collection stewards, barricading their village's central storehouse and declaring they would rather face punishment than surrender food their own families desperately needed to survive the remaining winter months. Garrick, his authority already weakened by Damien's growing skepticism, pressed urgently for a show of military force sufficient to crush this open defiance before it inspired similar resistance throughout other villages within the kingdom. Damien, however, found himself hesitating once more. Aldrich's counsel and his own growing uncertainty regarding the wisdom of ruling primarily through fear, weighing heavily against his advisor's persistent recommendations. "I will travel to the eastern villages myself," Damien finally decided, surprising the entire council with his announcement. "I will hear their grievances directly, before deciding how this kingdom responds." Garrick objected strenuously, warning that such a personal visit risked the king's safety amid open unrest, and would signal weakness to those already testing the crown's authority. Damien, however, remained firm in his decision, departing within days, accompanied by a modest guard rather than the significant military force Garrick had originally proposed. What Damien found upon arriving at the eastern villages proved far more sobering than any report had adequately conveyed. Families living in genuine hardship, children visibly thin from insufficient food, elderly villagers too weak from the harsh winter and inadequate resources to properly recover their strength. The village elder who eventually agreed to speak with him directly, a weathered woman named Old Winnie, did not soften her words despite addressing her king directly for the first time in her long life. "We do not resist out of disrespect for the crown, my king," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without the fear or deference he had grown accustomed to receiving from his court. "We resist because we have given everything already. 3 collections in a single season, while our own children go hungry, through no fault beyond simple poor fortune with this year's harvest. We ask only for the same mercy any parent would ask, the chance to feed our own families before meeting demands that exceed what we genuinely have to offer." Damien listened to her words, and to the accounts of numerous other villagers who gathered cautiously to share their own hardships once it became clear he had come to genuinely listen rather than simply enforce further punishment, and felt something shift uncomfortably within his own understanding of the kingdom he had spent years believing he ruled effectively through strength and firm control. He thought again, unbidden, of Elena, of the humiliation he had inflicted upon her without genuine cause beyond her family's misfortune she bore no responsibility for causing. Upon returning to Ashenmore Castle, Damien made decisions that surprised his entire court, suspending further tax collection from the eastern villages until the following harvest proved more successful, and beginning a broader review of policies enacted under Garrick's increasing influence throughout recent years. Garrick himself, sensing his diminishing authority within the court, grew increasingly desperate, and it was during this period of internal upheaval that further confirmation arrived regarding the settlement in the Southern Territories, delivered not through another captured scout, but through a traitor who had passed near the valley's edge and witnessed enough to report genuine, organized strength growing steadily within those old abandoned lands. The traitor spoke of a young woman commanding evident respect and authority among a sizable and growing community, a woman other travelers along the border routes had begun referring to, in hushed and increasingly reverent tones, as the reborn flame of the old Emberkin bloodline. Damien listened to this report with a complicated mixture of apprehension and something he did not immediately recognize within himself, something that felt uncomfortably close to pride, mixed with genuine regret regarding the role his own cruelty had played in setting this remarkable transformation into motion. Whatever confrontation eventually awaited between his kingdom and the growing power rising steadily within the Southern Territories, Damien understood with increasing clarity that the woman he had once dismissed and humiliated without a second thought had become someone he could no longer afford to underestimate, nor, he found himself reluctantly admitting during quiet moments of honest reflection, someone he any longer wished to see harmed by whatever conflict the coming months might eventually bring. Spring had finally arrived across the valley, melting the deep winter snow into rushing streams, that fed the fields where settlement residents now worked planting the season's first crops, and Elena stood once more at the edge of the ancient ruins, where her journey within these territories had truly begun, nearly a full year earlier. The community surrounding her had grown into something far beyond what she could have imagined during those first uncertain weeks following her escape from Ashenmore Castle, now numbering well over 200 residents, drawn from more than a dozen previously scattered communities throughout the region. "Elena," Elowen called out, approaching with a folded piece of parchment carried carefully in her weathered hands. "A message has arrived, from a source I trust completely." Elena accepted the parchment, unfolding it carefully to read the contents. The message, written in careful, deliberate script, came from Aldrich, the elderly council advisor within Damien's court, whom Elowen had maintained careful, secret contact with over recent months through a network of trusted intermediaries, built gradually, since the earliest days following Elena's escape. "Significant changes are occurring within the king's court," the message read. "Lord Garrick's influence has diminished considerably following his attempted independent military action against your settlement. The king himself has begun questioning the foundations of his rule, particularly following a personal visit to the eastern villages that revealed the genuine hardship his policies have caused. I believe, though I cannot promise certainty, that the king may be more receptive to genuine dialogue than he has been in the past. Whether this represents opportunity or simply temporary weakness within his court remains uncertain, but I believed you deserved to know of these developments." Elena read the message twice, turning its implications carefully over in her mind, before looking up toward Elowen, who watched her with quiet, patient attention. "What do you make of this?" Elena asked. "I believe it confirms what we have suspected for some time," Elowen said carefully. "That Damien's kingdom grows increasingly unstable, weakened by internal division, and the accumulated consequences of years spent ruling primarily through fear, rather than genuine care for those under his authority. Whether this instability represents opportunity for peaceful resolution, or simply increased danger as a weakened court grows desperate, remains to be seen." Elena called an emergency council meeting that evening, sharing Aldrich's message with Bramwell, Cassandra, Callan, Mira, and the other trusted leaders who had guided the settlement's growth alongside her over the preceding year. The discussion that followed proved lengthy and complex, weighing carefully the potential risks and benefits of any direct action toward Damien's weakened kingdom, whether through continued patient waiting, cautious diplomatic outreach, or more decisive action, while the kingdom's internal divisions remained at their current height. "I believe the time has come to act," Elena said finally, once the various perspectives had been thoroughly discussed. "We have spent the past year building genuine strength and unity among our people. We have trained defenders capable of protecting this settlement should conflict prove unavoidable. And now we learn that the kingdom which once drove my family into ruin, and which humiliated me so thoroughly upon my arrival within its walls, faces genuine internal instability that may never again present such a clear opportunity for meaningful change." "What do you propose specifically?" Cassandra asked, her sharp eyes studying Elena carefully. "I propose we travel to Ashenmore Castle directly," Elena said, her voice steady despite the significant weight of what she was suggesting. "Not as a hidden fugitive slipping through darkened corridors, nor as a helpless servant sent to eat among strangers, but as the leader of a community strong enough to demand genuine recognition and respect. We will offer Damien a choice: formal acknowledgement of our sovereignty over these reclaimed territories, and genuine partnership moving forward, or continued conflict that his already weakened kingdom may struggle to sustain given its current internal divisions." A tense silence followed her proposal, several council members exchanging uncertain glances before Bramwell finally spoke. "This is a significant risk, Elena," he said carefully. "Traveling directly to the castle exposes you personally to considerable danger, regardless of whatever internal weakness currently affects the king's court." "I understand the risk," Elena said, "but I also believe that continued hiding, however successful it has proven thus far, ultimately delays rather than resolves the fundamental conflict between our reclaimed community and the kingdom that once sought to erase our bloodline entirely. If genuine change is possible within Damien's court, as Aldrich's message suggests, I believe we owe it to everyone who has joined us, and to everyone still scattered and hiding throughout these territories, to pursue that possibility directly, rather than allowing fear alone to dictate our continued path forward." The council debate continued for some time, but ultimately, driven by Elena's steady conviction and the accumulated trust she had earned through a full year of demonstrated leadership, the decision was made to proceed with a formal delegation to Ashenmore Castle, accompanied by a sufficient show of organized strength to demonstrate the settlement's genuine capability, while still emphasizing diplomatic intention over open aggression. Preparations for the journey consumed the following weeks, as Elena worked closely with Callan to organize a delegation that balanced impressive demonstration of their community's growth and strength against the genuine desire to pursue peaceful resolution rather than immediate conflict. Nearly 50 trained defenders would accompany the core delegation, alongside representatives from each of the major communities that had joined the settlement over the preceding year, ensuring that whatever outcome emerged from their journey reflected the collective will of everyone who had contributed toward building their reclaimed strength. The night before their departure, Elena found herself once more standing before the ancient carved stone fragments that had first drawn her attention nearly a year earlier, tracing the familiar spiraling flame patterns with fingers that now carried permanent markings mirroring the ancient carvings themselves, undeniable proof of how completely her journey had transformed her since that first humiliating night within Ashenmore Castle's Great Hall. Elowen joined her quietly, studying the ancient carvings alongside her former student. "Tomorrow marks a significant turning point," the old woman observed. "Whatever awaits at that castle, know that you do not travel there as the same person who once fled through darkened forests, uncertain and afraid. You travel as someone who has built genuine strength and community from nothing but hardship and determination. I could not have built any of this without you," Elena said sincerely, turning to face her mentor directly. "Thank you, Elowen, for everything you have taught me, and for believing in what I might become, even when I struggled to believe it myself." Elowen's weathered features softened with genuine emotion. "You have exceeded anything I dared hope for when I first recognized the emberkin mark upon your arm beneath that old oak tree," she said quietly. "Whatever awaits tomorrow, I believe you are fully prepared to meet it, carrying not simply your own strength, but the accumulated hope of everyone who has placed their trust in your leadership this past year." The following morning dawned clear and bright, the delegation gathering at the settlement's central clearing, as residents who would remain behind gathered to witness their departure. Mira embraced Elena warmly before the journey began, having chosen to remain behind managing the settlement's continued operations alongside Bramwell during Elena's absence. "Return to us safely," Mira said, her voice carrying quiet emotion despite her attempt at composed strength. "Whatever happens at that castle, remember that you carry an entire community's hope with you, but also remember that we love you, regardless of the outcome, not simply for what you might accomplish, but for who you have become throughout this difficult journey." Elena embraced her friend tightly, grateful beyond words for the loyalty and support Mira had shown consistently since that very first night in the castle kitchens. So long ago it sometimes felt like a different lifetime entirely. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will return, I promise you that." The journey toward Ashenmore Castle proceeded steadily over the following days, the delegation moving with organized purpose, rather than the desperate, hurried flight that had characterized Elena's departure from those same lands nearly a year earlier. As they drew closer to the kingdom's borders, word of their approach inevitably reached ahead of them, carried by travelers and border patrols who witnessed the organized, impressive procession moving steadily toward the castle that had once cast Elena aside so completely. Within Ashenmore Castle itself, news of the approaching delegation created immediate, significant upheaval throughout the court. Damien received the report with a complicated mixture of anticipation and genuine apprehension, aware that whatever encounter awaited would likely determine not simply his kingdom's immediate future, but perhaps his own understanding of everything he had once believed regarding strength, leadership, and the cost of cruelty exercised without genuine consideration for its consequences. Garrick, his influence continuing to diminish steadily throughout recent months, argued forcefully for immediate defensive preparation, viewing the approaching delegation as clear confirmation of the aggressive threat he had warned against for nearly a full year. Damien, however, found himself hesitating once more. Aldrich's steady counsel, and his own accumulated reflection over recent months, weighing heavily against his former advisor's persistent recommendations toward confrontation and force. "We will receive them formally," Damien finally decided, surprising his entire court with the announcement. Whatever grievances exist between this kingdom and the woman I once humiliated so thoroughly within these very walls, I believe they deserve honest reckoning, rather than immediate conflict born from fear and unexamined suspicion. As the delegation finally arrived at the outskirts of Ashenmore Castle's surrounding fields, Elena felt the weight of the coming moment settling heavily, but steadily across her shoulders. Memories of her first arrival at these very gates, nearly a year earlier, surfacing with vivid clarity, despite how completely her circumstances had transformed since that humiliating night. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had once hoped desperately for simple acceptance and peace through an arranged joining she never truly desired. She arrived now as the leader of a reclaimed and thriving community, carrying strength and purpose, earned through genuine hardship and determined growth, prepared finally to face the reckoning that had been building steadily since the moment Alpha King Damien Ashgrove first sent her to eat among the servants, never imagining the extraordinary transformation that single act of cruelty would eventually set into motion. The castle gates stood open as the delegation approached, a deliberate signal, Elena realized, that Damien intended a formal reception rather than immediate confrontation. Still, she noted the significant presence of armed guards lining the approach, positioned with careful precision along the walls and courtyard, a visible reminder that whatever peaceful intentions the gesture of open gates suggested, the kingdom remained prepared for conflict should the meeting turn hostile. Callan rode close beside her, his expression alert and watchful despite the outwardly calm demeanor he maintained for the benefit of the delegation following behind them. "Stay close to your guard throughout this meeting," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Whatever assurances Aldrich's message offered, we cannot afford to assume genuine safety until we have confirmed Damien's true intentions directly." "I do not intend to lower my guard," Elena assured him, though her attention remained focused primarily on the castle looming ahead, its familiar stone walls carrying memories both painful and, in their own strange way, foundational to everything she had since become. As they passed through the outer gates and into the main courtyard, Elena noticed immediately the subtle signs of change within the kingdom she had once fled in desperate fear. Where she remembered guards and servants moving with the tense, guarded caution common throughout Damien's court during her earlier time here, she now observed something slightly different, a cautious curiosity mixed with the same wariness, as though the entire castle held its collective breath awaiting the outcome of whatever encounter was about to unfold. A formal escort awaited them near the castle's main entrance, led by a face Elena recognized immediately, despite the year that had passed since their last encounter. Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered features carrying genuine warmth as he offered a respectful bow toward Elena and her assembled delegation. "Welcome back to Ashenmore Castle, Elena Hartwell," he said formally, though something softer colored his tone beneath the official greeting. "The king awaits you within the Great Hall, prepared to receive your delegation with the respect and formal recognition your position and accomplishments deserve." Elena studied the old advisor carefully, recognizing him as the source of the message that had reached her, weeks earlier, through Elowin's careful network. "Thank you, Aldrich," she said quietly, allowing genuine gratitude to color her formal response. "Your message reached us safely, and I believe it has helped shape a more measured approach to this meeting than might otherwise have occurred." "I am glad to hear it," Aldrich said sincerely. "Much has changed within this court since your departure, Elena. I believe you will find the king considerably different from the man who once wronged you so thoroughly, though I leave you to judge that transformation for yourself." As they proceeded through the castle's familiar corridors toward the Great Hall, Elena felt the weight of countless memories pressing against her, the narrow servants' passages she had once traveled while carrying supplies, the kitchen she could glimpse briefly through a side corridor, still bustling with familiar activity despite the year that had passed. She caught sight of old Greta briefly through the kitchen doorway, the stern head cook pausing her work to watch the delegation pass with an expression of unmistakable pride and recognition, offering a small, respectful nod that Elena returned with genuine warmth despite the formal procession continuing steadily around her. Near the entrance to the Great Hall itself, however, their procession encountered an unexpected obstacle. Lord Garrick stood waiting, flanked by several guards whose loyalty clearly remained tied more closely to his diminishing authority than to the king's more recent, uncertain shift toward reconciliation. "This meeting proceeds against my strong recommendation," Garrick said coldly, addressing Elena directly for the first time since her departure from the castle nearly a year earlier. "I do not believe the threat your settlement represents can be so easily dismissed through polite formal reception and careful diplomatic language." Elena met his gaze steadily, drawing upon the calm, measured strength she had cultivated throughout months of difficult leadership and training. "I did not come here seeking conflict, Lord Garrick," she said evenly. "But I will not be intimidated by threats or suspicion, as I once might have been, when I first arrived at this castle with far less understanding of my own strength and worth than I carry with me today." Garrick's expression tightened further, clearly recognizing that whatever influence he had once held sufficient to shape the court's response toward Elena had diminished considerably during the intervening year. "You believe yourself powerful now," he said quietly, dangerous undertones coloring his careful words. "But power without proper wisdom to guide it often proves its own undoing, Miss Hartwell. I would advise caution, regardless of whatever strength you believe you have accumulated within those southern territories." Before Elena could respond further, Aldrich stepped forward with quiet but unmistakable authority. "Lord Garrick," he said firmly, "the king has specifically ordered this delegation receive formal and respectful passage. I suggest you reconsider whether continued obstruction serves your own interests, given your own position's increasingly precarious standing within this court." A tense silence followed before Garrick finally stepped aside, though his expression carried clear, simmering resentment as the delegation continued past him toward the great hall's tall entrance doors. Elena felt Callan tense beside her, clearly recognizing, as she did herself, that Garrick's diminished authority had done little to diminish the genuine danger his continued resentment and influence within certain factions of the court might still represent moving forward. As they finally approached the great hall's entrance, the same doors Elena had walked through nearly a year earlier, carrying hopeful, if uncertain, expectations for peaceful joining between two broken kingdoms, she paused briefly, drawing a steadying breath as the weight of the coming moment settled fully across her shoulders. Elowen, walking close beside her throughout the formal procession, reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Whatever awaits beyond these doors," Elowen said quietly, "you do not face it as that uncertain girl who once walked through them alone. You face it as a leader who has earned every bit of the strength and respect you now carry, surrounded by those who have chosen freely to stand beside you throughout this remarkable journey." Elena nodded, gratitude and steady resolve settling firmly within her chest as she straightened her shoulders and faced the tall doors ahead. Whatever reckoning awaited within that great hall, whatever transformation Damien himself had genuinely undergone during the year since her humiliating departure, she understood with complete certainty that she would meet it fully prepared, carrying not simply her own hard-won strength, but the accumulated hope and unwavering loyalty of an entire reclaimed community standing steadily behind her. The great doors swung open before her, revealing the familiar grand hall beyond, and Elena stepped forward to meet whatever awaited within. The great hall looked exactly as Elena remembered it, tall windows filtering pale morning light across the long feast table, the same towering hearth where fire had crackled the night of her humiliation nearly a year earlier. But the atmosphere within the hall carried none of the cold, mocking cruelty she remembered from that first devastating night. Instead, a tense, watchful silence greeted her arrival. Nobles and court members gathered along the hall's edges, their expressions carrying curiosity and undisguised apprehension rather than the cruel amusement she recalled from her earlier visit. Damien stood near the head of the table, not seated in casual dismissal as he had been during their first encounter, but standing with careful, deliberate attention, his expression unreadable as Elena entered at the head of her delegation. She noted immediately how different he appeared from the cold, dismissive king she remembered, something weathered and thoughtful, replacing the careless arrogance that had once colored his every gesture. "Elena Hartwell," Damien said formally, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Welcome back to Ashenmore Castle." Elena stopped a measured distance from the table, meeting his gaze directly, without the nervous uncertainty that had once caused her hands to tremble at her sides during their first encounter within this very hall. "Thank you for receiving my delegation, my king," she said, her voice carrying steady, unmistakable authority. "Though I confess I did not expect such a different welcome from the one I received during my previous visit to this hall." A ripple of uneasy tension passed through the assembled court at her pointed reference to that earlier humiliation, and Elena watched carefully as Damien's expression shifted, something like genuine discomfort crossing his features before he responded. "I owe you a genuine apology for that earlier welcome," he said, his words carrying a weight and sincerity that clearly surprised many among the gathered court, judging by the murmurs that spread quickly through the hall. "I acted that night out of unexamined suspicion and cruelty that I have come to regret deeply during the months since your departure. Nothing I say now can undo the harm caused that evening, but I offer this apology sincerely, before this entire court, acknowledging fully the wrong I committed against you." Elena studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words against the memory of everything that humiliation had set into motion, both the pain she had endured and the extraordinary transformation that pain had eventually inspired. "I appreciate your words, my king," she said finally. "Though I did not travel here today seeking apology alone, I have come representing a community of considerable size and strength, reclaimed and rebuilt from the scattered remnants of bloodlines, your kingdom, and others like it, once drove into hiding and desperate survival." Damien nodded, gesturing toward the table where formal refreshments had been arranged, a stark contrast to the humiliating dismissal she had received during her first visit. "Please," he said, "let us discuss these matters properly, as equals, rather than as king and subject." The formal discussions that followed extended through much of the day, Elena and her delegation presenting the settlement's genuine strength and organization, while Damien and his remaining trusted advisors, including Aldrich, engaged with careful, genuine attention, rather than the dismissive suspicion Elena had feared might still color the kingdom's response. Elena spoke of the reclaimed territories, of the scattered communities united under careful, patient leadership, of the genuine desire for formal recognition and peaceful coexistence rather than continued conflict or forced submission. "I do not ask for your kingdom's territory, nor for conflict that would harm either of our peoples unnecessarily," Elena said during one particularly significant exchange. "I ask only for formal recognition of our sovereignty over the reclaimed Emberkin territories, and genuine partnership moving forward, built on mutual respect, rather than the fear and suspicion that once characterized relations between our peoples." Damien listened carefully throughout these exchanges, occasionally consulting quietly with Aldrich and his other advisors, though notably absent from these discussions was Lord Garrick, whose continued resentment and obstruction had apparently earned him formal exclusion from the day's proceedings, following his earlier confrontation near the hall's entrance. By late afternoon, as the formal discussions drew toward their natural conclusion, Damien rose from his seat, addressing the full gathered court with careful, deliberate authority. "I have listened carefully throughout today's discussions," he announced, "and I find myself convinced that the path forward for this kingdom, and for the reclaimed territories Elena Hartwell now leads, lies not through continued conflict or suspicion, but through genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. I hereby formally recognize the sovereignty of the reclaimed Emberkin territories under Elena Hartwell's leadership, and I extend a formal offer of alliance and peaceful cooperation between our two peoples, moving forward from this day." A significant murmur passed through the assembled court at this formal declaration, some clearly relieved by the prospect of avoided conflict, others visibly uncertain regarding this dramatic shift from the kingdom's previous approach toward those it once considered beneath genuine consideration or respect. Elena felt a profound sense of vindication settling through her, though tempered by careful awareness that formal declarations alone did not guarantee lasting change without continued genuine effort from both sides moving forward. "I accept this offer of alliance, my king," Elena said formally, though privately she felt the weight of an entire year's difficult journey finally settling into something approaching genuine resolution. "I believe this partnership offers real opportunity for both our peoples, provided it is built and maintained through continued honesty and mutual respect, rather than empty formal declaration alone." As the formal proceedings concluded and the gathered court began dispersing, murmuring amongst themselves regarding the day's remarkable developments, Damien approached Elena directly, a private moment amid the continuing activity throughout the great hall. "I owe you more than simply this formal apology and alliance," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I have thought often, these past months, of that night I humiliated you so thoroughly before this entire court. I told myself for a long time that my suspicion toward your bloodline and your family's history justified my cruelty. I understand now that justification was simply cowardice disguised as caution, an unwillingness to look honestly at my own failures as a ruler, choosing instead to project that failure onto someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Elena studied him carefully, recognizing genuine reflection within his words rather than simple political convenience. That cruelty caused me genuine pain, she said honestly. But I have also come to understand, through this past year's difficult journey, that pain does not always simply diminish us. Sometimes, if we allow it, it can become the very foundation upon which we build something far stronger than we ever believed ourselves capable of becoming. Damien nodded slowly, something like genuine respect crossing his weathered features. Whatever partnership our peoples build together moving forward, he said, I hope it might also allow for something resembling genuine friendship between us as well, though I understand if that hope proves too much to ask, given everything that has passed between us. Elena considered his words carefully before responding. Friendship is not something easily rebuilt from such difficult beginnings, she said honestly. But I do not believe it entirely impossible either, provided it is built slowly, through continued honest actions, rather than simple words alone. That evening, before Elena's delegation departed Ashenmore Castle to begin their journey homeward, Damien extended an unexpected invitation, one carrying quiet, deliberate significance, given everything that had transpired between them, exactly 1 year earlier. I would like to host a proper feast this evening, he said, addressing Elena directly within the now empty Great Hall, as servants began preparing for the evening meal. Not simply a formal diplomatic dinner, but a genuine celebration, with everyone from your delegation seated as honored guests at my own table, alongside the members of my own court. Elena studied him carefully, recognizing the deliberate symbolism woven through his invitation, an intentional correction of the humiliation inflicted exactly 1 year earlier, within this very hall. I would be honored, she said quietly, genuine warmth coloring her voice for the first time since her arrival that morning. That evening, the great hall filled once more with the warm glow of torchlight and the rich aromas of a proper feast, but the atmosphere carried none of the cold cruelty Elena remembered from her first visit. Instead, laughter and genuine conversation filled the hall, as members of her delegation sat alongside Damien's own court, Callan seated near several of the kingdom's own military commanders discussing defensive strategies with genuine mutual respect. Bramwell deep in conversation with Aldrich regarding the old histories both men had spent years carefully preserving through difficult circumstances. Elena herself sat near the head of the table, not banished to eat among servants as she once had been, but honored as a guest of significance whose journey and accomplishments the entire hall had gathered to formally recognize. Old Greta, whom Elena specifically requested be invited from the kitchens for at least a portion of the evening's celebration, appeared briefly near the hall's entrance, beaming with obvious pride as she witnessed the remarkable transformation of the young woman she had once quietly comforted with warm stew and genuine kindness during those difficult early days. You have come a long way since that first difficult night, old Greta said warmly, when Elena rose briefly from her seat to embrace the older woman with genuine affection. I could not have survived that first night, nor everything that followed, without the kindness you and so many others showed me, when this castle offered nothing but cruelty, Elena replied sincerely. Thank you, for everything. Later in the evening, as the formal celebration continued around them, Elena found herself stepping briefly outside into the castle's quiet courtyard, seeking a moment of peaceful reflection amid the day's overwhelming developments. Callan joined her there shortly afterward, his presence familiar and comforting after everything they had endured together throughout the preceding year. It is strange, being back here, under such different circumstances, Elena admitted, gazing up at the same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight through darkened forests nearly a year earlier. Strange, but well-earned, Callan said quietly, moving to stand beside her. I am proud of everything you have accomplished, Elena. Prouder than I know how to properly express. Elena turned to study him carefully in the soft moonlight, recognizing something warm and unspoken that had grown steadily between them throughout their shared journey over the preceding year. Something neither of them had yet found proper words to fully acknowledge, amid the constant demands of building and protecting their reclaimed community. I could not have built any of this without you standing beside me, she said softly. Your loyalty, from that very first night in the kitchen, meant more to me than you likely realize. Callan reached out gently, taking her hand in his own, with careful, deliberate tenderness. "I intend to keep standing beside you," he said quietly, "for however long you will have me there, Elena. Whatever the future holds for our reclaimed territories, and for the continued partnership we have built here today, I hope it might also hold room for something more between us, should you wish it as genuinely as I do." Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, unrelated entirely to her emberkin strength, as she studied his familiar, steady expression in the soft moonlight. "I have hoped for exactly that, for longer than I have been willing to fully admit, even to myself," she said softly. Their quiet moment together was interrupted gently sometime later by Mira, who found them still standing together in the courtyard, her knowing smile suggesting she had perhaps suspected this particular development for considerably longer than either Elena or Callan had openly acknowledged between themselves. "The celebration continues without you both," she teased gently, though her genuine happiness for her closest friends was unmistakable beneath her playful tone. "Come, before Bramwell finishes every last bit of old Greta's famous honey cake, without leaving any for either of you." Elena laughed, genuine and unguarded, as she allowed herself to be pulled back toward the warm celebration continuing within the great hall, Callan's hand still held gently within her own. Whatever formal challenges and continued careful diplomacy still awaited in the months and years ahead, building lasting peace between two peoples who had once stood so firmly opposed, Elena understood in that peaceful moment beneath the stars that she had already accomplished something far more significant than simple political alliance or reclaimed territory. She had built, from nothing but hardship and unwavering determination, a genuine family of loyal friends and allies who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside her throughout every difficult step of her remarkable journey. In the weeks and months that followed this historic meeting, the formal alliance between Damien's kingdom and Elena's reclaimed Emberkin territories gradually strengthened, through careful, consistent effort from both sides. Trade routes opened between the two territories, benefiting communities on both sides of the previously contested border. Damien, guided increasingly by Aldrich's steady wisdom and his own genuine reflection following his eastern village visit and subsequent meeting with Elena, continued reforming his kingdom's approach toward its own common people, gradually rebuilding the trust and stability that years of rule, through fear alone, had steadily eroded. Lord Garrick, his influence entirely diminished following his continued resistance toward the new alliance, eventually departed the kingdom entirely, seeking whatever fortune he might find elsewhere, rather than continuing to serve a court that had firmly rejected his calculated suspicion and cruelty as guiding principles. Elena returned to her own settlement following the historic meeting, greeted with overwhelming celebration by Mira, Bramwell, and the entire community, who had waited anxiously for news of the delegation's outcome. The settlement continued growing steadily in the following months, formally recognized now as a legitimate territory rather than simply a hidden refuge, drawing additional scattered communities who had previously remained too fearful to consider joining their efforts while their status remained uncertain and unrecognized by surrounding kingdoms. Nearly a year after that historic meeting within Ashenmore Castle's Great Hall, Elena stood once more before the ancient carved stone fragments that had first drawn her attention upon her arrival within these territories, now surrounded by a thriving, formally recognized community that stretched across the entire reclaimed valley and beyond. Elowyn joined her, as she often did during these quiet reflective moments, studying the ancient carvings alongside her former student, whose own permanent markings now matched the spiraling patterns carved into stone by ancestors many generations removed. "You have accomplished something truly remarkable," Elowyn observed quietly. "Reclaiming not simply your own bloodline's strength and dignity, but building genuine peace and partnership from what once seemed an impossible foundation of cruelty and humiliation." Elena considered her mentor's words carefully, gratitude and quiet pride settling steadily within her chest as she surveyed the thriving community stretching across the valley before her. "I could not have accomplished any of this without everyone who chose to stand beside me throughout this journey," she said sincerely. "Without your guidance, without Mira and Callan's unwavering loyalty, without Bramwell and Cassandra, and everyone who trusted enough to join our cause when the outcome remained genuinely uncertain." "Perhaps," Elowyn said gently, "though I believe you carried within yourself, from that very first humiliating night in Damien's Great Hall, exactly the strength and resilience necessary to eventually build everything you see before you now. Sometimes it simply requires the right circumstances and the right support to finally allow that inherent strength to fully emerge. As the sun began setting behind the distant hills, casting warm golden light across the thriving valley that had once existed only as scattered ruins and forgotten history, Elena felt a profound sense of completion settling steadily within her, though she understood clearly that the work of building lasting peace and genuine partnership between her reclaimed territories and the surrounding kingdoms would continue requiring careful, ongoing effort for many years to come. But standing here now, surrounded by the community she had helped build from nothing but hardship and determined hope, carrying the reclaimed strength and dignity of an ancient bloodline that had once been driven into fearful hiding, Elena understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them not as the humiliated servant girl once sent to eat among strangers, but as Elena Hartwell, leader of a reclaimed kingdom, carrying forward a legacy of resilience and hard-won strength that would continue inspiring generations long after her own remarkable journey had finally reached its rightful, well-earned conclusion.